Chapter 3505. Chu Ho walked in front of him again. Don't be shy. Who doesn't have a childhood? Look, didn't you like those things when you were young? It's Xiao Bao's birthday today, so just let him be. Gu Jinglian said expressionlessly, do as you wish. After saying that, he left with an ashen face. In the morning, many parents sent their children over. At first, many parents were worried. After all, Xiao Bao's parents were not to be trifled with. If their children were to be naughty in front of them and offend them, they might follow in Li Xianlai's footsteps. However, they were on tenterhooks the entire journey. When the car stopped at the entrance of the Gu residence and they got out of the car, they saw a figure in a costume standing at the entrance to welcome the guests. When the children saw it, their eyes lit up. Oh my God! It's Big White. Big White from Superpower Marine Corps. The children all surrounded him, as if they wanted to pounce on him. The parents were also stunned. Who would have thought that the birthday party at the Gu residence would be so different from what they had imagined? This time, they were relieved. However, this birthday party was too different. The birthday party that they had imagined was probably what they had imagined, with the entire hotel booked. When they first heard that it was being held at the Gu residence, they were still wondering how big the Gu residence was and if it could accommodate a class of children. When they reached the entrance, all the parents who came to send their children were stunned. Wasn't this 2F** king big? It was just like the mansions of the wealthy in ancient times. Just walking through the entrance and seeing the winding corridors, as well as the huge garden and courtyard, they were scared out of their wits. They sucked in a deep breath and only let it out when they left the Gu residence. It was 2F** king big. Many parents got lost in the winding corridors. He was indeed rich and overbearing. This piece of land was one of the most expensive in the entire capital. It could be said that every inch of land was worth an inch of gold. Rumor had it that if this land was taken over by the government, it would definitely cost at least 300,000 yuan per square foot. According to their estimation, the entire Gu residence could no longer be measured in square feet. It was more appropriate to use the unit mu to measure it. Comparing oneself to others is really infuriating. Many parents sighed with emotion. They had been working hard since they were very young. After working hard, they finally managed to buy a condominium that was 100 square meters. In the capital, this was considered a standard for the wealthy. Many of them relied on their ancestors' real estate. The main government had demolished 2 houses. Otherwise, with the current housing prices, which were easily tens of thousands of yuan per square meter, and the central area was hundreds of thousands of yuan. How could they afford it? Who would have thought that other people's houses were measured in acres? If the Gu residence was demolished, several buildings could be built. What was even more frightening was that the ownership of the land was in the hands of the Gu family. The government didn't dare to touch it at all. In other words, even if the Gu family were to fall into ruin one day, they could still rely on the mansion to support several generations of people. There was no doubt about this. Many parents had come in worried, but when they saw their children being brought in by people in cartoon costumes, they left with peace of mind. Xiao Bao had been waiting at the door. Until a Mercedes-Benz slowly drove over and stopped. A young woman opened the car door and carried Shang'er out. Shang'er. When Xiao Bao saw Shang'er, he happily ran to her and held her hand. He said shyly, "Why are you only here now? I've been waiting for you for a long time." Chapter 3506. I'm sorry, birthday boy. There was a traffic jam on the way, so I'm late. It's okay. Xiao Bao said a little embarrassedly. Shang'er immediately took out an exquisitely wrapped present from behind her back and shyly handed it to him, saying, "Xiao Bao, happy birthday." "Oh, thank you, here. This is a present for you." I don't know if you'll like it." Shang'er's voice became softer and softer, obviously very shy. However, Xiao Bao seemed very excited and said expectantly, "Can I open it?" "Now?" Shang'er said, "You can open it if you want, but if you don't like it, don't be angry, why would I?" As long as it's a present from Shang'er, I'll like it. Okay. Xiao Bao opened the present curiously and saw a bouquet of flowers lying quietly in the gift box. However, this bouquet of flowers was different from ordinary bouquets. This bouquet of flowers was tied up with many starry sky lollipops. Shang'er didn't know what present to give, but thinking that Xiao Bao liked to eat sweets, she tied all her favorite starry sky lollipops into a bouquet and made it into a bouquet of flowers. Wow! The beautiful starry sky lollipops instantly lit up his eyes. He suddenly leaned close to Shang'er and kissed her on the cheek, saying happily, "Thank you, Shang'er. I like it a lot." Shang'er's face suddenly became as hot as a burning cloud. So much so that she stuttered, You like it, as long as you like it. These sweets. I can't bear to let my dad eat them. But because you're my best friend, so. Shang'er's mother squatted down and said to Xiao Bao, "I'll leave Shang'er in your care today." Okay. Shang'er, have fun today. Mommy will come to pick you up later. Okay. The two little guys watched as the car left. Xiao Bao immediately held her hand and said with a smile, "Shang'er, come in quickly." Shang'er was led through the door by Xiao Bao. As soon as she stepped through the door, she was shocked to see the yard full of cartoon characters. She was so shocked that her eyes widened. Wow! Other than gasping in amazement, Shang'er was so excited that she couldn't say a single word. Shang'er also liked to watch cartoons. She had watched many Disney animated movies many times. Her favorite movies were Frozen, and she also liked Dubai from Superland Marines. As such, tears welled up in her eyes as soon as she saw Dubai. In the hearts of young children, the characters in these animated films were not just limited to the adult world. The word cute was enough to describe them. To them, these people were the hottest superstars, and even more so, their dreams. Most of the children in the class had arrived and were playing with the cartoon dolls in the yard. It was as if he was in a fairy tale world. Shang'er even suspected that she was dreaming. Xiao Bao asked, "Jean, you also like Dubai, right?" "Yes. I like Big White the most." Xiao Bao immediately said, "Dubai. Come here." Hearing his little masters summon, Dubai immediately rushed over and waved his hand as he stood in front of them with his big belly. Xiao Bao introduced, "This is Princess Shang'er." Shang'er stared at Dubai nervously. Chapter 35:07. Shang'er blushed shyly. "Hello, Dubai." Pausing for a moment, she suddenly smiled brightly and placed her hands behind her back shyly. "Dubai, can I hug you?" she asked nervously. Dubai tilted his head, looking very adorable on the surface. However, the scar-faced man in the costume had a gloomy expression on his face. He was the worst at dealing with children. Even so, Xiao Bao glared at him fiercely from the side, as if he would not hold back if he dared to refuse. Dubai immediately opened his arms and said gently, "Of course." Shang'er blushed even harder, but she happily pounced toward Dubai. Upstairs, Gu Jinglian looked at the yard full of dolls and little ghosts with a gloomy expression. Originally, having such a stupid and idiotic son like Xiao Bao was already enough to give him a headache. Now, he had to deal with a bunch of brats. Especially in Xiao Bao's class, there were a few mischievous children who were fooling around in the yard. They climbed up the rockery nimbly, and below them was the pond. Uncle Fu stood at the foot of the rockery anxiously and tried to coax them to come down. "They won't come down. They won't come down. Wow! There are so many fish in the pond. The fish are so cute. I really want to touch them." A group of children lay by the pond and looked around. Gu Jinglian raised his eyebrows gloomily. The children's chattering filled his ears, and it was as if thousands of mosquitoes were flying around his ears. That was why he hated little brats the most. They were especially annoying. Speaking of Gu Jinglian, he was not a fan of brats. At first, he did not have much patience with Xiao Bao. However, after spending some time together and getting used to this guy, he sometimes found him very cute. Although he was really annoyed when he was annoyed. However, he was still his son. However, he might not have half the patience to deal with other children. Gu Jinglian closed the window and returned to his study. After a while, Uncle Fu came upstairs and knocked on the door. "Master, the cake is about to be cut. I don't have to show up," Gu Jinglian said impatiently. He felt extremely troubled at the thought of going downstairs to cut the cake and having to face dozens of little idiots. "That's not very good, is it? After all, you are Xiao Bao's father. If you are not present on Xiao Bao's birthday, it will inevitably make the little guy unhappy." Gu Jinglian, he rubbed his brows tiredly and stood up abruptly. 10 minutes later, Gu Jinglian appeared downstairs and happened to bump into Chu He pushing the three-tiered cake pagoda into the dining room. The cafeteria was very big. There were 10 tables in the cafeteria. 4 children sat at one table while Little Treasure and Shang'er sat at another table. The table was filled with sumptuous dishes, fruits, desserts, and all kinds of delicacies. However, the children did not care about it at all. They were looking forward to the cake, so the delicacies in front of them did not attract their attention at all. Everyone looked around, looking forward to it. It was not until Chu Ho slowly pushed the cake tower into the dining room that the delicate-looking cake fell into the children's line of sight, causing a huge commotion. No one had ever seen such a beautiful and exquisite cake. Chapter 3508. This was specially made by Uncle Fu. He realized that Xiao Bao especially liked to buy. Hence, he sent his subordinates to ask around and found the best cake shop in Beijing. He reserved this cake half a month in advance. The cake tower had 3 levels, and each level was filled with chocolate. On the top level, the pie was made with icing and looked extremely adorable. It was a 100% replica of the cartoon image in the movie. Wow! What a beautiful cake! Many of the children widened their eyes in envy. When Chu Ho pushed the cake to the center, many of the children were already drooling. Gu Jinglian had just stepped into the restaurant when he heard a sea of cheers. "Dubai! What a beautiful cake! Ah, I want that Dubai!" Gu Jinglian's head was about to explode from the noise. Chu Ho immediately said, "Xiao Bao, why aren't you coming up? It's almost time to share the cake." Xiao Bao had just walked over and started looking for a knife and fork. Uncle Fu immediately stopped him and said, "Xiao Bao, you haven't sung the birthday song yet." "Oh, right. The birthday song." Shang'er stood up and turned around. "Let's sing the birthday song for Xiao Bao." "Okay." The children who were eager to eat the cake were surprisingly cooperative. They clapped their little hands and the sound of clapping could be heard. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to Xiao Bao. Happy birthday to you." Clap, clap, clap. The sound of hands clapping. 30 or so immature voices of children sounded out. They were tone deaf, and they were like demonic voices that could destroy everything in their path. Gu Jinglian was almost possessed by the voices, but Xiao Bao was overjoyed. Chu Ho placed the crown on his head and urged, "Xiao Bao, make a wish." "Okay." Xiao Bao immediately clasped his hands together, closed his eyes, and began to make a wish. Immediately after, he made his wish and blew out the candles. "Happy birthday to Xiao Bao. Let's eat cake. Let's eat cake." The children swarmed forward like a tide. Uncle Fu immediately rushed over to maintain order. "Don't fight. Let our little birthday girl cut the cake." Xiao Bao looked up at Gu Jinglian and said nervously, "Dad, the cake is so tall. How do we cut it?" The cake was more than a meter tall, but he was not even as tall as the cake. Even if he stood on his tiptoes, he could not cut it. Gu Jinglian looked at him with disdain, but immediately bent down and hugged him in his arms. Chu Ho held his little hand, and together, the mother and son cut the cake. When it was time to divide the cake, the group of little fellows started to squabble. "I want big white. Dubai is mine. 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 Mine." Shang-er tugged at Xiao Bao's sleeve and said pitifully, "Xiao Bao, I really like big white. Can you give Big White to me? Of course. Xiao Bao said to everyone, can you give Big White to Shang? A boy stood up and said indignantly, why should Shang be the only one? Xiao Bao, you're biased. I want it too. Shang pouted. Seeing this, Xiao Bao put on a protective stance. Give it to Shang Give it to me. Big White is Shang-er's. Big White is mine. Gu Jinglian could not take it anymore and directly cut Big White in half. Clean and straightforward. Half each. Xiao Bao, Shang-er. Chapter 3509. The scene suddenly quieted down, not a single sound could be heard. All the kids were stunned as they stared blankly at the center of the cake. Dabai was originally extremely adorable, but now, it was pitifully sliced in half and poured onto the cake. Looking at this tragic murder scene, everyone was shocked. Dabai. It was unknown which brat let out a ghostly wail and howl, but the group of children trembled in fear. Dabai was cut in half. Dabai is dead. Shang'er's eyes reddened. She blinked and choked. Dabai, Chu Ho, this. She turned around and glared at Gu Jinglian. What are you doing? Dividing the cake. Who told you to cut Dabai in half? Gu Jinglian, how else should I cut it? Cut off the head? Chu Ho was speechless. You're just dividing the cake. Do you have to be so bloody? Gu Jinglian was even more speechless. It's just a cake. Why do you have to be so bloody? Seeing the children huddle together and yell, Gu Jinglian and Chu Ho started arguing again. Uncle Fu immediately put on disposable gloves and began to remedy the situation. He lifted the two halves of Dabai and smeared some cream in the middle. However, the two halves were barely glued together. He broke out in cold sweat. Okay. Since Xiao Bao is our birthday boy today, let's give Dabai to him, okay? The group of children regained some energy. Uncle Fu placed the repaired Dabai on Xiao Bao's plate. Xiao Bao held the plate in his hand and walked to Shang'er. He said shyly, Shang'er, you like Dabai the most. I'll give you Dabai, okay? Shang'er nodded with red eyes and immediately smiled through her tears. Uncle Fu began to divide the cake. The children held the cake in their hands and realized that the cake's filling was rainbow-colored. What a beautiful cake. I can't bear to eat it. The next time I celebrate my birthday, I'll ask my mother to buy me a cake like this too. But it should be very expensive, right? The group of children chattered as they munched on the cake. Xiao Bao was eating happily with Shang'er when a few children sneaked up behind him and shouted, Xiao Bao. Xiao Bao had just turned around when his face was suddenly smeared with cake. Happy birthday. Ahahaha. The atmosphere was cheerful and warm. Uncle Fu divided 2 pieces of cake and handed them to Chu Ho and Gu Jinglian. He smiled and said, Old master, it's time to eat the cake. I'm not eating. I know you don't like to eat cake, but today is Xiao Bao's birthday. This cake must be eaten. Only then did Gu Jinglian take it. When Xiao Bao saw Gu Jinglian, he couldn't help but want to tease him. He smeared the cake on both his hands and sneaked behind Gu Jinglian. He giggled and said, Daddy. Gu Jinglian had just turned his head when he saw Xiao Bao reaching out his 2 little paws that were smeared with cream and waving at him. Almost instinctively, Gu Jinglian slapped the cake in his hand onto Xiao Bao's face. The tray gradually slid down. Xiao Bao stood there in a daze. His face was smeared with cake and was unrecognizable. Chu Ho, Uncle Fu, the children immediately roared with laughter. Ha ha ha. Xiao Bao howled, Daddy is a big baddie. Chapter 35:10. Chu Ho couldn't help but laugh. Even though she tried to restrain herself, she still couldn't help but laugh out loud. She had seen fathers who cheated their sons, but she had never seen a father who cheated his sons like this. Ha ha ha. She was halfway through her laughter when Gu Jinglian took the cake and pressed it against her face. Chu Ho couldn't laugh anymore. Cream covered her face, and when she breathed, She inhaled the cream into her nostrils. Chu Ho opened her eyes in embarrassment. Only a pair of dark eyes could be seen on her face that was covered in cream. She looked extremely embarrassed. Xiao Bao and Chu Ho looked at each other with a sense of empathy. Gu Jinglian looked at the mother and son. His originally cold face cracked, and he broke into a smile. His lips curved into a smile. Ha! For some reason, his smile was brighter than the sun outside the window. It was as if the whole world was glowing. He was born handsome, but he was usually unsmiling and had a very cold and serious face. She also rarely saw him smile. Even though he would occasionally curl his lips into a cold smile, it was enough to send chills down people's spines and make them shudder. However, his smile now was a smile from the bottom of his heart. It was as bright as the galaxy. It turned out that a man could be so charming when he smiled. He was a little dazed. It was Xiao Bao who reacted immediately. He pointed at Gu Jinglian in surprise and said in disbelief, "Dad is smiling." It was also his first time seeing Gu Jinglian smile, so he was extremely excited. Gu Jinglian awkwardly regained his cold expression and glared at him with a sullen expression. Xiao Bao immediately felt wronged and said, "Dad, you look good when you smile. Why are you always like an old man? You should smile more." "Shut up." Gu Jinglian suddenly stood up and said, "I'm going back to the study." With that, he turned around, his cold expression returning, and quickly left. Chu Ho and Xiao Bao looked at each other and smiled tacitly. "You naughty brat." Chu Ho lovingly scratched the bridge of his nose. Xiao Bao was about to throw himself into her arms. "Don't come over." Her alarm bells rang, but before she could dodge, Xiao Bao had already thrown himself into her arms and rubbed the cake on her face all over him. Xiao Bao. When the children saw this, they were also infected by the warm and happy atmosphere and laughed. In the afternoon, the children were tired from playing and settled down a lot. At 4 o'clock, parents came to take their children home one after another. Even when it was time to go home, many children were still reluctant to leave. They stood at the door and reluctantly said goodbye to Xiao Bao, obviously reluctant to leave. Many children saw their parents and excitedly described the interesting things that happened that day to them. At 6 o'clock in the evening, all the children except Shang were taken home. Shang was tired from playing and fell asleep in the guest room while hugging Xiao Bao's big bear. However, gradually, Shang's mother still didn't appear until night fell. Chu Ho couldn't help but worry. She called Shang's mother several times, but her phone was turned off. When Shang woke up and saw that her mother still hadn't appeared to pick her up, she was a little unhappy. Although she also liked Xiao Bao's house very much and wanted to play for a while more, her mother still hadn't appeared at this late hour, so she couldn't help but feel a little helpless. When Chu Ho walked into the guest room, Shang went up to her worriedly and asked nervously, "Did you get through to Mom's phone?" "No." Chapter 35:11. Chu Ho explained, "It's turned off. Maybe it's out of battery." "What's going on? Why is it turned off?" Shang felt wronged and said, "Did Mommy forget about me?" Chu Ho smiled and comforted her, "How can that be? Don't think too much. Maybe your mommy got off work late, or maybe she was stuck in a traffic jam." Shang pouted and looked very wronged. She looked like an abandoned stray dog, her eyes red. Xiao Bao walked over and said to Shang, "Don't worry. If your mommy really forgot about you, you can stay at my house tonight. We can sleep together." Why else would they say that children's words carried no harm? With Xiao Bao's EQ and IQ, it was really difficult for him to comfort a girl. It would have been better if he hadn't said that. Now that he said that, Shang really thought that she had been abandoned. Her eyes, which were originally red, were forced to cry. "Boo-hoo. Shang wants to go home," Shang said as she walked towards the door. Chu Ho glared at Xiao Bao in disappointment and poked his head. "Do you know how to coax girls?" Xiao Bao was speechless. Chu Ho said, "You'll only scare Shang if you say that." The child was so young. If Shanger's mommy didn't come to pick her up, the child would only think that her mommy didn't want her anymore. She wouldn't think of anything else. After all, a child's thoughts were simple and more intuitive. Mommy, Shanger ran to the door and stood there, craning her neck to look around. However, the door was cold and cheerless. She looked around for a long time, but it was still in vain. Did Mommy really not want her anymore? Shanger sniffled with tears in her eyes. Her two little hands were intertwined, looking extremely worried. Chu-ho saw her standing at the door with an anxious expression. He walked over, squatted beside her, and hugged her thin body. Shanger, don't worry. Maybe your mommy has something to do and is late? Boo-hoo, if it's really too late, sleep with Xiao Bao tonight, okay? How is it possible that my mother didn't come to pick me up so late? Jean fiddled with her fingers and said pitifully, does mommy not want Jean anymore after you have a baby? Baby? Yes. Only then did Shanger tell him about her worries in full detail. It turned out that Shanger's mother was pregnant with her second child last month. One night, she pulled Shanger in front of her and asked her a serious question. Shanger, didn't you always want a younger brother or sister? Shanger blinked her eyes in confusion. When she was young, she saw a pair of twins in her neighbor's house. The boy and the girl were always together, holding hands. Shanger was very envious and unintentionally mentioned that if she had a younger sister or brother, she wouldn't be lonely. Thus, these words remained in his heart. Some time ago, Shanger's mother suspected that she was pregnant and went to the hospital for a checkup. When she found out that she was more than 2 months pregnant, the whole family was very happy. When Shang heard that her mother was pregnant with a Xiao Bao baby in her stomach, she was very happy. She said, sure. Of course. If I have a younger brother or sister, Shang will definitely take good care of them. However, when she went to school and told the other children about it, she received a lot of complaints. I hate my younger brother the most. Chapter 35:12. Xiao Bao. Tears welled up in Shanger's eyes. She placed her little hand on the glass of the window and her eyes were misty. She kept hitting the window and said anxiously, let me out of the car. Let me out of the car. Her aunt looked at her and followed her gaze to the back of the car. She saw a little boy chasing after the car. She asked, Shanger, who is this? It's Xiao Bao. It's Xiao Bao. Shanger kept crying and throwing tantrums. Stop the car. Stop the car. Gradually, Xiao Bao's figure disappeared from her sight. Shanger watched as Xiao Bao disappeared from her sight. Her eyes widened and tears kept flowing down her cheeks. Xiao Bao watched as the car slowly left. He had used up all his energy, but his body was gradually losing strength. His body was on the verge of collapsing and he fell limp to the ground. Shanger. Shanger. Xiao Bao clenched his little fists and said helplessly, don't go. Ever since Shanger left, Xiao Bao had been completely depressed. Even his appetite was not that good. He was depressed in school. When he got home, he would casually eat a few mouthfuls of rice and then run upstairs. He only knew how to lock himself in his room, depressed and lifeless. Chu-ho knew that he was in a bad mood because Shanger had transferred schools. However, as an elder, he did not know how to show his concern, so he just let him be. He was afraid that his depression would not dissipate anytime soon. He could only hope that he would accept this fact after a long time. Gu Jinglian, on the other hand, did not know what to do with this child. He heard from Uncle Fu that Xiao Bao had been depressed since Shanger transferred schools, but he did not say anything. Uncle Fu said, Xiao Bao is so young. I didn't expect him to have his first awakening of love. I feel that he likes Shanger a little. Now that Shanger is gone, he must be lonely. How could such a young child know anything about love? Gu Jinglian was speechless. I thought he had always been heartless. I didn't expect him to lock himself in his room all day over such a small matter. Uncle Fu suddenly asked cautiously, Master, are you leaving early tomorrow morning? Yes. I've heard that there are many war zones in North Africa right now. Soldiers are fighting non-stop. You must be very careful when you go there this time. Don't worry. The Gu family had a special pass. Even if they were to pass through the war zone, there would not be any mishaps. I'm not worried about those war zones. I'm just worried, when I'm not around, take good care of Xiao Bao. Don't worry about anything else. After that, Gu Jinglian said, I'm going to rest. Go and see if Xiao Bao is asleep. Yes. Uncle Fu left the room. As soon as he left, Chu Ho entered the room and saw him sitting in front of the desk, reading a pile of documents. Most of these documents were from the military headquarters in North Africa. Some of them were the prospectus of Hurricane Group and the acquisition proposal. To put it bluntly, Hurricane Group was going to compete with the Gu family for territory. However, Hurricane Group's methods this time were quite strong. Gu Jinglian originally thought that this acquisition proposal was outlined by Gong Jie. However, when he reached the end, he saw an unfamiliar name, Gong Fan. Gong Fan? He had never heard of this person. Chapter 35:13. She had been influenced by Gong Jie's deeds in Africa. It was said that when Gong Jie was carrying out a trading mission in Africa, he had encountered an armed rebel army. However, the army of hundreds of people was destroyed by Gong Jie's mercenary group in a flash. Hurricane Group controlled Mercenary Paradise. Mercenary Paradise was now the top mercenary organization in the world. Its style of doing things was vicious and merciless. The Gu family had always avoided fighting Hurricane head-on, and Hurricane also respected the Gu family's territory in North Africa. In the end, they did not expect that Hurricane would be the first to provoke them. Gong Fan? You're going to North Africa tomorrow? Chu Ho suddenly asked. Gu Jinglian came back to his senses and looked up at her. Chu Ho opened her mouth for a long time, but she could not say a word. She wanted to be concerned. At least when she went to North Africa, she had to be careful. After all, bullets did not have eyes. North Africa was a place where wars were endless. Bullets rained down and artillery fire filled the sky. How many times had she almost lost her life while carrying out missions in North Africa? However, no matter what, she felt that if she really said that, it would be too pretentious. What kind of person was Gu Jinglian? He was such a strong man, so he should be fine. She was worrying too much. Hence, Chu Ho did not say much. She hugged the blanket and lay down on the sofa. Gu Jinglian looked at her meaningfully, then suddenly retracted his gaze and looked down coldly. Early in the morning, he took a private plane and set off for North Africa. More than 20 hours later, the plane landed. Gu Jinglian took an armed car and went straight to the factory headquarters. Along the way, there was continuous artillery fire. Accompanied by the sound of gunshots, the car passed countless battle lines. On the road, by the bridge, by the river, everywhere he looked was filled with casualties. Recently, the war in North Africa has become more and more raging. The senior officer sitting next to Gu Jinglian sighed and said. He was the senior officer appointed by the Gu family in North Africa to be in charge of all the affairs of the factory in North Africa. His name was Gu Yan, and he was a branch of the Gu family. He was very capable when it came to handling matters. Gu Jinglian said coldly, "There is only business when there is war, isn't there?" "That's true." Gu Yan did not deny it. However, Hurricane Group's recent expansion has been very aggressive. I saw that there was a very unfamiliar name at the end of these documents. Gu Jinglian casually threw a document bag at him and suddenly asked, "Who is Gong Fan?" "Gong Fan, I've never heard of this name." Gu Jinglian turned around and raised an eyebrow coldly. This person doesn't seem to be in charge of North Africa. Gong Jie used to be in charge of North Africa's affairs. However, the so-called executor was the person in North Africa. I heard, this Gong Fan has a big background. Big what background? The Hurricane Group has been brewing a mysterious plan all this time. However, no one is Fan's eyes big. I only know that Gong Fan is an important part of this plan. Gu Jingnian grunted and closed his eyes to rest. The road was bumpy. Fortunately, the car's off-road performance was top-notch, so it did not feel much bumpiness. After more than 20 hours of travel, he looked indescribably tired. Chapter 35:14. What he wanted to say was that the Gu family would be doomed if they went head-on against Hurricane. This time, the Gu family's position in North Africa might not be able to withstand it. Hurricane had also set up many strategic fortresses in North Africa, as well as many as 12 large-scale military factories. At the same time, Hurricane was also the only private organization in North Africa that had the right to mine oil and natural gas. A black off-road vehicle, escorted by 12 fully armed tanks, drove into the heavily guarded military factory. The off-road vehicle stopped steadily in front of a warehouse. A few mercenaries rushed out of the car and surrounded it. One of the burly mercenaries looked around vigilantly. Even though they were in their own territory, they had to ensure their safety. He walked to the door, opened the door, and said respectfully in a deep voice, "Young master, we're here." After saying that, he knelt on the ground with one knee. The off-road vehicle's chassis was very high. The Toyota Land Cruiser, after being modified by force, was more than 30 centimeters off the ground. Beside the door, a young man in a black cloak held the door frame and stepped on the mercenary's back as he walked down. The mercenary slowly stood up. The young man stood up at a height of 192 meters. When the young man stood up straight, he only reached the mercenary's chest. The cloak was very large, wrapping his entire body in it. The hat was also buttoned up high, covering his entire face. The young man's entire face was buried in the shadows. His facial features and divine appearance could not be seen clearly. One could only vaguely tell that this was probably a very young child, about 8 or 9 years old. Under the cloak, he wore a black shirt and pitch-black trousers that wrapped around his slender and beautiful legs. At the entrance of the warehouse stood a row of men in suits. These were the senior leaders of the Hurricane Group's North Africa affairs. They bowed respectfully, not daring to neglect in the slightest. "Young master." The young man in the cloak slowly walked in front of them and stood still. Then, a slightly feminine and cold voice, with a cold and indifferent tone, came out concisely and comprehensively. "Is the goods here?" "Yes. Everything is in this warehouse. We have checked them one by one. There are no incomplete goods." "Show me." "Yes." The door of the warehouse slowly opened. The cloaked youth walked in with a sullen face. As soon as he stepped in, all the lights in the warehouse lit up. The heavy shuttered door fell behind him. The young man lowered his head, raised his fair hand, and slowly grasped the brim of his hat. He brushed the hat to the back of his head, and then, a young but shockingly handsome face was suddenly exposed to the air. The face that entered everyone's line of sight had fair and flawless skin, and a pair of deep eyes that were like deep ancient wells. If one stared at them, it was as if one's soul would be sucked dry. However, calling it an ancient well didn't seem too appropriate. His eyes were like a bottomless abyss at the bottom of the sea. His thick eyelashes were like the feathers of a black phoenix, overlapping layer upon layer, making his eyeliner look very thick. The bridge of her nose was high, and her lips were like cherry blossoms, tender and red. When she spoke, her mouth opened and closed, revealing her shell-like teeth. He was clearly such a handsome child, but his every move was as mature as an adult man's. He could be said to be mature, but at the same time, he could not be considered mature. He was definitely a mature child. Chapter 35:15. Gong Fan. This was definitely a strange yet familiar name to these higher-ups. It was unfamiliar because they had never heard of this child named Gong Fan before. There were only a few people in the Gong family, and Gong Fan was not one of them. However, overnight, Gong Xiaoying announced to everyone that Gong Fan was officially appointed as the person in charge of the Devasite project. Gong Xiaoying did not say much about this child's identity and origin. He only said that this was the future heir of the Gong family and the successor to his position. He was also the future owner of the Hurricane Group. It was said that this child was only 12 years old. However, everyone who had seen him in person felt that the age of 12 was somewhat exaggerated. This child looked only 8 or 9 years old. What was even more shocking was this child's methods and ability, as well as his outstanding talent in the field of arms and business, were absolutely unprecedented. After he was appointed as the person in charge of the Devasite project, he began to prepare a series of research and development processes. Everyone knew very well what the Devasite project meant to the Hurricane Group. If the plan succeeded, the Hurricane Group would become the world's undisputed overlord. Purchasing a few pieces of golden land in North Africa for research and investing hundreds of millions of US dollars as an experimental base was one of them. Nearly $1 billion worth of equipment were divided into batches and transported to the North African site within 10 days. This was the second. Kicking out more than a dozen people in charge of the North African market who were sitting on empty salaries from the Hurricane Group was the third. However, within a month, Gong Fan's name was enough to make many people fearful. Now, he actually wanted to compete with the Gu family for territory in North Africa. It really shocked many people. One had to know that the Gu family's dominance in the North African market was absolutely extraordinary. He was just a child, yet he dared to go against the Gu family. It was unknown if he was a newborn calf that was not afraid of tigers. He actually dared to be so arrogant. The young man walked to a row of shelves. The shelves were covered with a thick layer of dust-proof cloth. He casually lifted it, and the precision instrument parts came into view. He said coldly, "Will the acquisition be tomorrow?" "Yes. I heard that the people from the Gu family have already arrived. We have already sent someone to deal with them. Gu Jinglian will also be there tomorrow night. No matter what, we must make Gu Jinglian sign the agreement." The upper echelons looked at each other in dismay. "Young master, it's not good to offend the Gu family. They are very tight-lipped. I'm afraid it will be difficult to get them to sign the agreement." "Yeah, Gu Jinglian is a ruthless character. After all, they have dominated the North African market for many years. It will be difficult for them to remove the North African market. The Gu family's military factories in North Africa have made a lot of profits. Almost 1/5 of the Gu family's income came from this military factory. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for them to give up this piece of land." The youth turned around, his eyes cold and gloomy. "I only look at the results, not the process. If they don't sign, they can forget about leaving North Africa alive." As soon as his voice fell, the crowd could not help but break out in cold sweat from the imposing aura emanating from the youth's body. The rumors were indeed true. Chapter 35:16. This young man was so young, but he was so vicious and merciless. How dare he say such arrogant words? Moreover, I don't want to snatch their market. I only want the land of the Gu family's first factory. This is a condition that cannot be compromised. The young man paused and walked to the side. His gaze landed on the cold equipment on the shelf and he said calmly, "Either they close the factory and withdraw from the North African market. Or they move the factory to another place. There is no third option." "Yes, understood." Everyone bowed their heads, cold sweat dripping down their backs. The young man said, "Check the equipment and parts again. Don't miss anything." "Understood." After the young man left, the higher-ups finally heaved a sigh of relief. The hotel was heavily guarded within a radius of a few miles. In the room, Gong Fan sat on the sofa, holding a file in his hands. His slender and fair fingers flipped through the pages. His eyes scanned through 10 lines at a glance. In his mind, the data was like a gear, calculating rapidly. Lisa brought the black tea to the side table and asked carefully, "Master, when are you going to rest?" Gong Fan put a finger to his lips, indicating for her to keep quiet. Lisa understood and immediately retreated to the side. She walked to the side and hung his coat in the wardrobe. Suddenly, she heard a cough. Only then did she remember that it was already past 8 o'clock and it was time to take his medicine. Thus, she took the medicine box from the wardrobe and arranged the medicine that he should take one by one. She placed them on a small tray, poured some purified water, and handed it to him. "Master, it's time to take your medicine." Gong Fan looked up. A trace of fatigue appeared on his slightly pale face. His gaze was fixed on the colorful pills, and his brows furrowed slightly. Lisa immediately took out the candied fruits from her bag, opened the lid, shook a few out and handed them to him. Only then did Gong Fan take the pills and put them into his mouth. He swallowed them with the purified water and immediately ate a few candied fruits. He was afraid of bitterness. As long as it was slightly bitter medicine, he would only take it with the candied fruits. "It's getting late. It's time to rest." Gong Fan nodded, put the file aside, and slowly stood up. When he passed by the balcony, he looked out through the floor-to-ceiling window. He could vaguely see flames and smoke thousands of meters away. The hotel was only a few thousand meters away from the battlefield. However, this was the headquarters of the Hurricane Group. Most of the Chinese factories were located here. Separated by a bridge, a boundary of peace and war was formed. The war in North Africa had reached its climax. At the same time, the sales of weapons continued to increase along with the war. This meant that the North African market had become the focus of Hurricane Group. Gong Fan suddenly pushed open the door and walked to the balcony. The night breeze blew against his face and woke him up a little. Lisa followed closely behind him, only to hear him say faintly, "Listen, what a beautiful sound." Gong Fan closed his eyes and listened to the sound of gunfire coming from not far away. His thin lips curved slightly and his handsome eyebrows raised slightly. Just a few months ago, Gong Xiaoying announced that Gong Fan would be the person in charge of the Heaven's Eye project. Everyone was unfamiliar with this name that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Especially Gong Jia. He did not know who this successor, who had appeared out of nowhere, was. Chapter 35:17. This name was almost the top secret of the Hurricane Group. No one could find out about it. They only knew that this name represented the highest authority. Gong Jia was the chief commander of the Hurricane Group. Before this, other than Gong Xiaoying, everyone obeyed his orders. However, Gong Fan's appearance broke this monopoly. Although Gong Jia was still the chief commander on the surface, the situation in the Hurricane Group had suddenly changed. Gong Fan, a name that had never been heard of before, had almost become the person with the highest authority. And Gong Jia did not expect that this child called Gong Fan was Yu. War, since ancient times, has always been an unsolvable proposition. Gong Fan opened his eyes slightly, and a cold voice slowly came out from his thin lips. Gong Jia actually wanted to use the Sky Eye plan to achieve the goal of peace. Utterly stupid. Lisa frowned, but a strange expression appeared on her face. When the Sky Eye plan was first established, it was only a bold idea of Yu. The so-called Sky Eye plan was to use quantum technology to lock down the sky, control absolute air supremacy, and seal off the world's information. When that day came, even if they wanted to start a war, they could forcefully stop it. When this plan was proposed, everyone in the Hurricane Group had their own ulterior motives. World peace. No war. It was met with opposition from almost everyone. One had to know that the Hurricane Group was born from war. If there was no war in this world, then there would be no Hurricane Group. An overlord group that relied on selling firearms to survive in this world. If there was really no war in this world, then how would the Hurricane Group survive if they lost the firearms business? Where would they sell so many weapons? What was even more unbelievable was that Yu actually had a very positive attitude towards this plan. Locking down the sky and controlling absolute air supremacy would inevitably mean that they would become an overlord that surpassed all countries. As the saying went, it was lonely at the top. Since ancient times, no dynasty had been able to preserve 1,000 years of history. This was because human ambition had always been endless. This was almost a biological instinct. In the animal world, the weak were prey to the strong. Similarly, the human world was the same. Everyone wanted to be the winner. From the petty infighting in the workplace to the disputes of interests between countries, no one had ever been able to retreat from the whirlpool of interests. This was the only law that existed in the world. Whether it was passive or active, humans learned to fight for something from the moment they gained consciousness. Power, wealth, ambition, desire, and even women. Those at the top wanted to secure their throne while those at the bottom wanted to climb up by any means necessary. There had never been a person, a country, or a period of history that could maintain its position as the overlord for more than 1,000 years. World peace. This was the biggest joke of the century. War would only end when people's ambitions withered away. Similarly, civilized society would also regress for hundreds of years, stagnating. However, compared to Yu Yu's ambition, Gong Fan's ambition was even greater. The night breeze blew gently. I want this world's war to be born because of me, and to die because of me. Chapter 35:18. If she had to use a word to describe it, Yu Yu was warmth. Gong Fan, on the other hand, represented destruction. Lisa could still remember when Yu Yu first joined Hurricane. He had vowed, only when I'm strong enough can I protect the people I want to protect. However, when that pure and warm Yu Yu was sealed away forever, he returned as a youth who was so cold that he did not seem to be made of flesh and blood. Only when I'm strong enough can I prevent my fate from being dictated by others. Gong Fan, who had returned, was like a terrifyingly ambitious schemer. Master, Lisa looked up with a conflicted expression and mustered up her courage to ask, do you still remember Yun Tianyu? In her memory, it was Yun Tianyu's warm smile when he smiled at her. However, when their gazes met, the Yu Yu reflected in her eyes had become so cold. Gong Fan turned around expressionlessly and raised a brow. Who is Yun Tianyu? Should I know him? Have you forgotten? You don't remember at all? Gong Fan's voice was as cold as ice. There's no such name in my memory. Therefore, he should be an insignificant person who was not worth keeping memories of. Lisa weakly smiled. If you don't remember, then forget it. She paused for a moment before saying, it's cold. Let's go back to the room. Gong Fan entered the room. Lisa closed the balcony door and looked at his back thoughtfully. The next night. In the hotel's conference hall. When Gu Jinglian arrived, it was already 7 in the evening. On his way here, he passed by the war zone and was delayed for some time. When he reached the conference hall, it was filled with people in black suits. These were the Hurricane Group's North African market executives. A youth in a black cloak sat at the table with his back facing him. The brim of his hat was pulled up high to cover his entire face. His subordinate beside him reminded him that this youth in a black cloak was Gong Fan. Why is it a child? This is my first time seeing him, too. I didn't expect it to be such a young child. Just as Gu Jinglian was about to walk in, one of his subordinates pulled him back and said worriedly, Mr. Gu, I'm worried that this is a trap. It was said that there were very few people who had seen Gong Fan's face. Most of the people who had seen him in person no longer existed. One could imagine how ruthless this child was. He was simply like the Grim Reaper. So what? Gu Jinglian looked back and said coldly, from the moment I stepped into North Africa, I had already entered Hurricane's territory. Since we're already here, let's take things as they come. Gu Jinglian walked in and sat down at the table. Hearing the footsteps behind him, Gong Fan slowly turned around and looked at him. His lips curled up coldly. You're 3 minutes late. Oh. Gu Jinglian raised his eyebrows but did not think much of it. So, is there any punishment for being late? That depends on your performance. The youth's voice was very cold. He raised his hand and a man beside him immediately walked over and handed him a document. Gong Fan pushed the document in front of him and said lightly, You should have already read this agreement. Yes, I have. Gu Jinglian's gaze fell on the document and he laughed mockingly. So, you invited me here not to negotiate with me at all, but to let me sign my name directly. Chapter 35:19. Oh. Then, what if I don't sign it? Gu Jinglian suddenly pushed the document away. His expression was equally cold. The young man looked up slightly. Under the cloak, his face was buried in the shadows, and it was impossible to see his face clearly. The entire conference hall was dominated by the people from the hurricane group. However, even so, Gu Jinglian still looked calm and composed. He sat at the table calmly, facing Gong Fan. Invisibly, the auras of the two people fiercely clashed several times. They were actually evenly matched. Lisa, who was standing behind Gong Fan, looked at Gu Jinglian. She actually felt that this man had the same temperament as Gong Fan. Cold and icy. Even in such a tense atmosphere, his aura did not lose out at all. Gong Fan said, "You have to sign it." "Why?" Gu Jinglian glanced at the document and crossed his arms arrogantly. "I can't accept the unfair terms on the document. Similarly, I, Gu Jinglian, am also a capitalist of the Hurricane Group. Capitalists don't make meaningless deals. It's your business if you want this piece of land. If I don't give it to you, it's my attitude." Gong Fan suddenly sneered and said slowly, "The terms on this document can't be said to be unfair to you." "What do you mean?" The young man said coldly, "There are many ways to deal with real inequality. Similarly, there are many ways for me to get that piece of land. I can buy it. Similarly." Pausing, his upper body slightly leaned forward. Beneath his cloak, a pair of deep eyes stared at him without blinking. He enunciated each word clearly. "I can also raise your military factory to the ground in a single night. At most, I'll blow up this piece of land into ruins and rebuild it." "Ha!" Gu Jinglian frowned and narrowed his eyes. However, the corners of his lips curled into a mocking smile and he let out a contemptuous sneer. "Are you threatening me?" "That depends on what you think. You can't threaten me with just you." Gu Jinglian mocked, "The Hurricane Group is so powerful. Why would they go against the Gu family? There are so many pieces of land in North Africa, and you picked the one in my hands? Cut the crap." A man beside Gong Fan slammed the table and angrily pointed at Gu Jinglian, saying, "You have to sign today whether you want to or not. Otherwise, don't even think about leaving." Before he could finish his sentence, Gu Jinglian gave him an impatient look. The mercenaries behind him immediately stepped forward, took out their guns, and aimed between the man's eyebrows. With a bang, they fired. In less than a minute, the arrogant and overbearing man had already fallen to the ground, turning into an ice-cold corpse. Fresh blood continued to seep onto the ground, dyeing it red. The man's eyes were wide open. Even in death, he maintained an angry expression. Gu Jinglian said coldly, "No one has the right to interrupt me when I'm speaking." Gong Fan glanced sideways dangerously and frowned slightly. Behind him, the mercenaries of the Hurricane Group immediately raised their pistols and aimed accurately between Gu Jinglian's eyebrows. The mercenaries behind Gu Jinglian immediately raised their hands and aimed their submachine guns at Gong Fan. In an instant, the two sides faced each other with swords drawn. However, Gong Fan, who was pointed at by dozens of guns, still sat motionless on the chair without any fear. Chapter 35-20. Gong Fan glanced at the mercenaries behind Gu Jinglian from the corner of his eye. He glanced sideways and signaled with his eyes. Lisa, who was behind him, immediately understood. Facing so many mercenaries from the Gu family, she walked calmly to the mercenary who had shot Gong Fan's subordinate. She grabbed his throat and twisted it tightly with her knuckles. That mercenary couldn't help but smile mockingly. The person standing in front of him and strangling his throat was only a girl of about 10 years old. She had such a small figure, especially her hands, which were small and thin. Did she think that she could break his throat? What kind of joke was this? However, before a mocking laugh could come out of his throat, Lisa's fingertips were filled with strength. She suddenly released her grip and the mercenary's throat was broken. A crisp, crack sound was heard. It was extremely crisp and clean. In the next second, the mercenary didn't even have time to resist. His body fell down and leaned against the wall weakly. He twitched violently and stopped moving. She killed without spilling blood. With just one hand, she ended the life of an adult mercenary. A little girl under Gong Fan actually had such terrifying combat power. In an instant, everyone was even more vigilant. However, they saw Lisa return behind the youth. She lowered her eyes and the hostility on her face gradually faded. She was like a killing machine, ready to be ordered at any time. And the only master in her eyes was the silent youth sitting in his seat. Gu Jinglian narrowed his eyes slightly. However, he heard Gong Fan's low voice slowly ring out. Gu Jinglian, you and I are both capitalists. Since we are capitalists, we will never do a business that is at a loss. In other words, you hurt my subordinate's life. Naturally, you have to use your subordinate's life in exchange. When Gu Jinglian heard this, he was slightly stunned. Then, his lips curled up into a smile. You are so young, but you are so arrogant. Such ruthless methods are really not simple. However, Gong Fan sneered. You dare to go against me. You are not simple either. His arrogant tone didn't give in at all. The two of them sat opposite each other. Their auras clashed, but for a moment, it was hard to tell who was superior. Although the scene was deathly silent, the shadows of swords and sabers could be seen everywhere. Gu Jinglian was the first to break the silence. Since I dared to come here, I have some confidence. This hotel has long been surrounded by the Hurricane Group's people. I'm afraid it'll be difficult for me to leave. Gong Fan remained silent. Gu Jinglian continued, Hurricane Group wants to buy the land in my hands for nothing more than to develop the Heavenly Eye project. If this land is used as a test site, with its unique electric energy field, it is indeed the best choice. However, I will not sign this agreement. Of course, I don't have to worry about you razing my factory to the ground. Gong Fan raised his eyebrows but did not think much of it. Oh. How do you know? Gu Jinglian inched closer to him and gave him a devilish smile. He enunciated each word clearly. Because there are thousands of fuses buried under this ground. Once one is touched, it will instantly detonate the explosives buried underground. When that happens, it will be like dominoes. Everything within a radius of a few hundred miles will be devastated. After a pause, he said meaningfully, you can try blowing one up. Gong Fan's usually cold and dead face finally revealed a slightly stunned expression. He didn't expect Gu Jinglian to be so generous as to bury so many explosives underground. Chapter 35-21. Gu Jinglian said casually, even if you spend a lot of effort to rebuild it, this explosion will definitely destroy the electromagnetic field here. In that case, this piece of land will be completely destroyed. Even though this was not a big deal to the rich and powerful Hurricane, this was the only place in the entire world where the electromagnetic field was unique. Other than here, there is no other magnetic field station. Gong Fan narrowed his dark eyes slightly, and his body overflowed with hostility. The air seemed to freeze because of this, and it was suffocating. How much explosives did you bury? Gu Jinglian smiled leisurely. It's enough to blow up an entire Atlanta island. Impossible. The power of explosives alone would never produce such a strong explosive force. It's impossible, but you seem to have neglected that other than explosives, there is abundant natural gas underground. A year ago, Gu Jinglian had already expected this. At that time, Hurricane had already set their eyes on this piece of land. After exploration, the rich natural gas and oil underground became the target of many capitalists. Therefore, he buried tons of explosives in advance. Explosives were not scary. What was scary was the natural gas. When it encountered explosives or open flames, there would be no life within a radius of hundreds of miles. In just a moment, the initiative of the situation had been overturned. Gu Jinglian had the absolute right to speak. In other words, it was either you don't covet this piece of land of mine, or you can openly snatch it or raze it to the ground. At worst, we'll die together. The Gu family would only lose a piece of land, but the Hurricane family would lose the only electromagnetic field station in the world. It had to be said that Gu Jinglian was very shrewd. He knew how to grasp the pros and cons. He hit the nail on the head and took the initiative from the passive side. When Gong Fan heard this, he was silent for a long time. Then, He suddenly curled his lips and let out a cold laugh. Rumor has it that the head of the Gu family is young but ruthless. Today, I have experienced it. Gong Fan paused, but his eyebrows were slightly furrowed. However, it is said that you have a 7-year-old son named Gu Qingze. Before he finished speaking, Gu Jinglian's face suddenly froze. Other than that, you also have a wife named Shu Ho. However, Shu Ho's background was not as simple as the information stated. She should be the former Interpol's top anti-crime inspector. Who would have thought that she would be married to the capital's #1 heiress? How ironic. Gu Jinglian's eyes flashed with a cold light. Gong Fan observed his reaction seriously and immediately became interested. What? You seem to care a lot about them? Gu Jinglian did not say a word, but his eyes were cold and vigilant. Gu Jinglian, I'm surprised that someone of your status would get married and have a child. Gu Jinglian remained silent. Rumor has it that the head of the Gu clan is heartless and cold. Gong Fan leaned slightly against the back of the chair and said lightly, with your status, if you have a weakness, it will inevitably be a hindrance. Do you need me to get rid of them for you? Gu Jinglian immediately said coldly, how dare you? Gong Fan said casually, I'm just being kind. I don't want these 2 extra people to drag you down. With your status, if you have concerns, it means that you have a weakness. Such a weakness will definitely become a stumbling block for you. Chapter 35-22. After a pause, Gong Fan rested his chin on his hand lazily and enjoyed Gu Jinglian's livid expression. He said slowly, look, if I use your wife and son's lives to threaten you to sign this agreement, will you sign it or refuse to sign it? His tone seemed calm, but it was full of threat. Gu Jinglian glared at him. His hands on the table gradually clenched into fists. He clenched his fists tightly and revealed his sharpness. Behind Gong Fan, the sound of a gun being loaded gradually came. If he dared to make any moves, he would definitely be shot to death on the spot. You're threatening me. That depends on whether you're willing to accept my threat. Even if he had to fight to the death, Gong Fan was determined to take down this experimental base station. The success of the Deva Ige plan depended on whether this piece of land could be successfully acquired. Therefore, to Gong Fan, this agreement was no ordinary agreement. Gu Jinglian suddenly let out a cold laugh. Why should I believe you? If I sign this agreement, will you let my wife and son go? Compared to the Gu family, the Hurricane Group's methods were even more ruthless and unscrupulous. So what if he signed this agreement? Since Gong Fan had investigated Gu Qingze and Chu Ho's information and even knew their movements, he could pose a threat to them at any time. Let's not talk about the distant, but the near. Now, even if he signed the agreement, he might not be able to leave alive. Before this negotiation, Gu Jinglian and Gong Fan each had a chance of winning. They were very conceited that they could win this battle. However, they each miscalculated. Gong Fan did not expect that Gu Jinglian would bury so many explosives under this piece of land. And Gu Jinglian did not expect that in such a short period of time, Gong Fan had already investigated Chu Ho and Gu Qingze's identities and backgrounds. In the face of the powerful Hurricane Group, the Gu family's last bargaining chip was not very persuasive. Gu Jinglian slowly closed his eyes. It was lonely at the top. With his status, falling in love was tantamount to touching the door of death. Wandering in such a bloody storm, what one feared the most was having one's weakness grasped by others. This inch of weakness was enough to be fatal. Therefore, he had always maintained a distant relationship with women. Even though he had had women before, without exception, he had never fallen in love. He knew very well that if he were to fall in love with her, it would undoubtedly expose his Achilles heel. Despicable. Yes, I'm despicable. Gong Fan sneered. Could it be that this is the first time you've seen Hurricane's way of doing things? I've never claimed to be a gentleman. I'll do whatever it takes to achieve my goals. That's my style of doing things. His gaze fell on the agreement again and he said casually, sign it. Don't worry, I don't like to shoot from the back. If you sign him, I'll let you leave North Africa safely. Gu Jinglian was so angry that he laughed and gritted his teeth. Then how should I thank you? He took the agreement and held the pen in his hand. Looking at the column of the agreement, he said, permanently cede the ownership of 500 mu of land in Mufelu. His eyes were almost overflowing with scarlet. What? I can't accept it. Gong Fan raised his eyebrows casually. Look, what an angry expression. But, I like it. Chapter 35-23. Lisa stood behind Gong Fan. Every word that came out of his mouth did not sound like something a person of flesh and blood would say. Even an emotionless killing machine like her felt a chill run down her spine when she heard these words. The bright and sunny Yu of the past seemed to have disappeared from this body forever. Now, the 9-year-old child in front of her, who was extremely mature, was more like a sick and paranoid devil. He used his admiring gaze to admire every loser who crawled at his feet. Ever since he became Gong Fan, his methods had become even more cold-blooded and emotionless. But for some reason, in the past, she despised Yu for being too soft-hearted. He always had that innocent and romantic look, pure and harmless. Instead, it made her feel that she was an out-and-out devil who killed people without batting an eyelid. But now, facing such a Gong Fan, she suddenly missed that bright smile. Every time she thought of it, she would feel warm. However, when she returned to reality, she knew very well that such a Yu would never come back to life. Lisa's face was filled with disappointment. After Gu Jinglian signed the agreement, when he pressed his thumbprint on the signature area, it meant that he had lost in this smokeless war. He had actually lost to this child. He was indignant, very indignant. He had lost completely. Ever since he became the head of the Gu family, no one had ever made him suffer a loss. He had always been a high-spirited man. However, under the influence of some unknown emotion, he actually signed this name as if he was possessed by gods and demons. He could have resisted signing it. But Gong Fan had used Gu Qingze and Chu Ho to threaten him. He could not ignore it. Perhaps, as he had said, he did not know when he had developed a concern in his heart. This concern had become his most fatal weakness at the same time. After Gu Jinglian signed the agreement, someone came over to take it away and handed it to Gong Fan for him to look through. Outside the window, the evening wind suddenly blew, and the hat on his head fell. The cloak and hat fell off his shoulders, revealing the youth's delicate and handsome face. On his fair face, his eyes were cold, and the indifference between his eyebrows seemed to be covered with a layer of ice. The moment Gu Jinglian saw his face, he was slightly stunned. This face was extremely familiar. Yun Tianyu? He still remembered that when Xingyu Financial Group held a press conference, Mu Yaja, who was already the chairman of Xingyu, had gathered more than 100 media reporters and announced Yun Tianyu's identity on the spot. Gu Jinglian also happened to see this news. In the camera, Yun Tianyu stood beside Mu Yaja with an obedient smile on his face. He looked like a well-mannered little gentleman. However, the two children's faces. Yun Tianyu? Comes. How troublesome. The mercenaries behind Gu Jinglian immediately stepped forward and fired. In an instant, smoke filled the air. The row of mercenaries behind him were all shot and fell into a pool of blood, their hearts beating out of them. Gong Shaoying had ordered that anyone who had seen Gong Fan's face should not be allowed to live. Chapter 35-24. Seeing that none of his subordinates survived in less than half a minute, Gu Jinglian's face was filled with shock. Dark clouds and anger gathered between his brows. One of the mercenaries walked in front of Gu Jinglian and raised his wrist. The desert eagle in his hand was aimed at Gu Jinglian's temple. He turned his head to look at Gong Fan. As long as he gave the order, he would immediately pull the trigger. Master, how should we deal with this person? Gong Fan raised his eyes coldly and said expressionlessly, I said before, let him leave safely. When the mercenary heard this, he immediately put away the desert eagle and returned behind Gong Fan. Gong Fan said, let's go. Gu Jinglian was extremely surprised. He actually let him go and let him leave? Gu Jinglian pursed his lips and looked at him with disdain. Don't play this trick. Don't tell me that if I turn around, someone will point a gun at me? Gong Fan said calmly, no one will shoot. Gu Jinglian was speechless. I will do what I say. This is also one of the principles of a capitalist. Gu Jinglian raised his eyebrows and suddenly stood up. He said word by word, you said it. After saying that, he suddenly turned around and walked towards the door. Behind him, one of the mercenaries saw that Gong Fan really let Gu Jinglian go. He gritted his teeth and reached for his waist belt. He gripped his gun tightly and suddenly pulled it out and loaded it. The cold muzzle of the gun was aimed straight at Gu Jinglian's back. His finger was on the trigger, ready to fire at any moment. Bang! A loud sound was heard. A gunshot exploded behind him. Gu Jinglian paused in his steps and looked sideways. From the corner of his eye, he saw that the mercenary who was waiting for an opportunity to sneak an attack had been shot and fell to the ground. He held his wrist that was shot and widened his eyes in disbelief as he looked at Gong Fan. Master, if you let the tiger return to the mountain, it will definitely become a threat in the future. Gong Fan leaned lazily against the back of the chair. His fingertips tapped on the table casually, and his expression was obviously a little impatient. I don't need you to teach me what to do. He's Gu Jinglian, and the Gu family is a big business. If he's allowed to leave North Africa, the consequences will be unimaginable. Shut up. Gong Fan said coldly, if you continue talking nonsense, you can go and die. The mercenary was so shocked that he shut his mouth, not daring to say anything else. Gu Jinglian left without looking back. Gong Fan slowly stood up, put on his hat, and walked towards the door. Lisa immediately followed. In the car, the two of them sat in silence. Lisa turned to look at the side of Gong Fan's face and clenched her fists tightly. When she thought of his cold words and actions at the negotiation table earlier, she hesitated for a moment. She suddenly tried to say a name. Yun Shishir. Gong Fan's expression did not change at all. He turned around and frowned slightly. It was obvious that he felt unfamiliar and puzzled by the name that came out of her mouth. What? Master, do you still remember this name? Yun Shishir. Gong Fan frowned and pondered for a moment. Then he asked coldly, should I remember this name? Lisa was stunned. For a moment, she did not know how to respond. Gong Fan asked again, who is she? She is, Lisa hesitated. When she saw that Gong Fan had really forgotten any memory of Yun Shishir, for some reason, her heart ached. Gong Fan said coldly, if it's a meaningless person, I naturally won't have any impression of her. After saying that, he looked out of the window again. Chapter 35-25. At the Gu residence. Chu Ho was lying flat on the bed with her arms under her head. She looked at the night sky outside the window, her thoughts in a mess. For some reason, her eyelids were twitching violently. After Gu Jinglian left, she had insomnia for 2 nights. She would toss and turn in bed until the wee hours of the morning before she could fall asleep. When she woke up the next day, she would go to work early and return home exhausted. At night, she would have insomnia for no reason. It was the same for 2 consecutive days, and she was exhausted. For some reason, she had an ominous feeling in her heart. Gu Jinglian went to North Africa. The next day, the news reported that the war in North Africa was gradually expanding, and the peacekeeping forces were about to intervene. Ever since the war started, North Africa had been divided into 3 regions. One was the war zone, one was the neutral zone, and the last was the peaceful zone. However, the war had already spread to the neutral zone, and several of the Gu family's major factories were built in the neutral zone. If the war spread, it would affect the Gu family's businesses. It was said that several airports in North Africa would be bombed into ruins. All air routes would be stopped, and international traffic would be paralyzed. This meant that many people would not be able to leave North Africa by plane. If they could not leave in time, they would become sacrifices for the war. This war had caused heavy civilian casualties, and various countries had begun to evacuate their nationals. Many people from developed countries had left early. China had also begun to evacuate its nationals on a large scale. Many of the Chinese factories in North Africa were now empty, leaving behind empty factories. The Chinese gathered at the country's embassy, waiting for orders to evacuate their nationals. The ship in charge of evacuating the nationals had already rushed to several major ports in North Africa. It was estimated that the evacuation would be completed within 3 days. Then, what about Gu Jinglian? If he continued to stay in North Africa, he would be in danger. She had to admit that this was a very strong man. Even the most powerful mercenaries were no match for him. However, it was the era of firearms. No matter how strong one's body was, it would be difficult to withstand cannons and bullets. Chu Ho asked Uncle Fu about Gu Jinglian, but Uncle Fu replied that communications were cut off and they could not contact the person in charge of the factory. There was no news. This meant that Gu Jinglian's life was in danger. Chu Ho did not feel good about it. She didn't know why. She clearly hated this man, but at this juncture, she was actually worried about him. Chu Ho turned over and hugged the pillow in his arms. He closed his eyes and forced himself not to let his imagination run wild. The door was suddenly pushed open. Butler Fu rushed in with a panicked expression and said in a panic, "Chu He. Something's wrong." Chu Ho suddenly sat up from the bed in shock and stared at him in a daze. When he met Uncle Fu's panicked gaze, the uneasiness in his heart suddenly expanded to its maximum. "What?" "I've received news that the Gu family's business in North Africa has been taken over by hurricane. All the employees who stayed behind in the factory have been expelled. He even said that the mercenaries who followed Master are all gone." "It's gone?" "Yes," Uncle Fu nodded, his voice trembling. "I heard that Master signed an agreement." When the negotiation ended, the dozens of mercenaries he brought with him were all shot dead on the spot. Chu He was dumbfounded by his words. Chapter 35-26. Why did he sign that agreement? Chu Ho was a little confused. "Gu Jinglian mentioned this to me. He said that he would not give up this business to Hurricane no matter what." "Why did he sign the agreement?" Uncle Fu's face twitched violently. He clenched his fists and said with some difficulty, "My men told me that Hurricane is using Xiao Bao and you as a hostage. If you don't sign the agreement, I'm afraid that it will be disadvantageous to you." "Old Master. Old Master might be worried about you, so." When Chu Ho heard this, he was stunned. The corners of his lips twitched, but he still didn't believe it. "That's impossible. Gu Jinglian is such an arrogant person. How could he give up such a big business for Xiao Bao and me?" Uncle Fu sighed and said, "Chu Ho, you might not be able to do it, but the onlooker sees more clearly. In Old Master's eyes, you are different from others. Maybe you think that Old Master is arrogant, but from what I see, ever since Xiao Bao came to the Gu family, Old Master has changed a lot." Chu Ho was speechless for a moment. Even though Old Master might not be like other fathers, and he might not be as gentle or patient, but he cares a lot about anything that threatens Xiao Bao. Old Master is not good with words, but that doesn't mean that I'm not a good father. Uncle Fu continued, "Old Master cares a lot about Xiao Bao. That was why he forced you to sign that agreement and threatened you to give up Xiao Bao's custody. If you were determined not to sign it, Old Master could have forced you to give in. However, he took into consideration the feelings between you and Xiao Bao, so he allowed you to stay in the Gu family. He even got a marriage certificate with you. Maybe it's hard for you to believe that a man like Old Master would fall in love with any woman. But from what I see, he really treats you differently. Maybe you are really special to him." With Old Master's temperament, he was destined not to be like other people, falling in love to the point of death. However, a person like him would never allow anyone to threaten his family. Chu Ho's lips suddenly trembled. She suddenly stood up, but her expression was surprisingly calm. "Uncle Fu, were all the airports in North Africa destroyed? Are you going to North Africa to find him? Answer my question first." Uncle Fu was stunned. He immediately nodded and said, "Yes, then, how can we get to North Africa?" "You can use a freighter," Uncle Fu said, the Gu family has a batch of firearms that are about to be shipped to North Africa, but it's a single flight. There's no return flight. Solo flight? Yes, it's very difficult to enter and leave North Africa now. The situation is tense. This cargo ship was sent by the North African military, so it's only a single route. When are we leaving? Uncle Fu finally couldn't take it anymore. Chu Ho, don't take the risk. Tonight or tomorrow night? Today. Today, tonight, Chu Ho raised her eyebrows in understanding and said, "Help me pack my luggage. I'm leaving tonight." Uncle Fu was shocked. Are you crazy? It's too risky for you to go to North Africa now. Chu Ho said firmly, "I want to bring him back." No. It's too risky. Chu Ho, don't be too rash. Chapter 35:27. Uncle Fu wanted to say something, but Chu Ho suddenly turned around and grabbed him by the collar. She said word by word, "Uncle Fu, let me tell you. Although I may not be Gu Jinglian's match in terms of fighting skills, I've been through a lot. But in terms of experience, I once crossed the battlefront alone and safely brought a hostage out of the center of the war. I was also chased by the enemy when I was on a mission. I was seriously injured, but I still managed to pass through the rainforest. Before I joined Interpol, I also joined the peacekeeping force. I'm very familiar with the terrain of North Africa. Gu Jinglian can't compare to this experience." Uncle Fu was so frightened by her hostility that he didn't say a word. Chu Ho stared at him and suddenly laughed coldly. "Why? Do you think I want to take this risk? If Gu Jinglian dies in North Africa, it has nothing to do with me. But he's Xiao Bao's father. I can't sit back and do nothing when there's no news of him. How are you going to find him?" Uncle Fu said, "North Africa is so big, and there's war everywhere. How are you going to find him? And how are you going to bring him back? North Africa is very big, but you said that Gu Jinglian is in neutral territory. Then, at least the range is locked in. If war breaks out, then other than the asylum station, the embassy, and the Prime Minister's residence, we can eliminate them one by one. Then we can locate his location." Uncle Fu was confused, but hearing her solemn vow, he thought that she probably had the confidence to bring Gu Jinglian back safe and sound. So, he nodded reluctantly. "If you don't have full confidence, don't take the risk." "Too bad. I'm just a bag of old bones. I can't help much." Chu Ho curled her lips into a smile and appeared relaxed. "You stay here and take good care of Xiao Bao." "Okay, I'll take good care of Xiao Bao. You said that Hurricane Group used Xiao Bao and me as a threat to force Gu Jinglian to sign the agreement." After squatting for a while, Chu Ho said, "To ensure Xiao Bao's safety, don't go to school for the time being. Ask for leave from the kindergarten." "All right." Uncle Fu helped her pack and walked to Xiao Bao's room. In Xiao Bao's room, Chu Ho quietly walked to the bedside and bent over slightly. Looking at the sleeping child, he frowned slightly. He was reluctant to part with him. Chu Ho gently caressed his forehead, closed his eyes, and planted a kiss between his eyebrows. "Good night, Xiao Bao." She hoped that the next time she said good night, it would be with Gu Jinglian. She swore to herself that she would bring Gu Jinglian back for the sake of Xiao Bao. The cargo ship that was scheduled to depart at 3 in the morning set off an hour earlier. Chu Ho caught up with the cargo ship in advance. Carrying a huge battlefield bag, she boarded the ship to North Africa. This cargo ship would take about 4 days and 4 nights to reach North Africa. However, this was almost the fastest way of transportation at the moment. The route was disrupted. It was said that in the war, all the railway tracks were blown to pieces by the rebels. The airport, cargo, and all other transportation were in a state of paralysis. Even if it took 4 days and 4 nights, it was the most optimistic speed. If it was slow, it might not even reach the neutral zone in North Africa in a week. To reach the port, they still had to pass through the flames of war and advance into the neutral zone. Chapter 35:29. Chu Ho was confident because she was already familiar with the terrain of North Africa. Even if the entire area was bombed to ashes, she could still recognize it from memory. When she was still in the peacekeeping force, she had gone deep into the battlefield and was responsible for patrolling the neutral and peaceful areas. At that time, the flames of war had already begun. However, in the blink of an eye, many years had passed, and the war still showed no signs of stopping. Even though the ceasefire agreement was signed 3 years ago, it had only been a year since the ceasefire, and local wars were still reignited. Now, it had become an international war. She could not help but suspect that Hurricane Group was fanning the flames. Hurricane Group had the ability to control the situation. Although the ceasefire was due to the intervention of the Shi forces, the anti-government forces had never given up on the idea of starting a war. However, the various countries controlled the military and took drastic measures to prevent the flames of war from spreading. Hurricane Group sold weapons secretly at low prices to the military and started the war again. Because of the weapons blockade and the anti-war prohibition agreement, the sales of any weapons to North Africa were strictly prohibited. Hurricane Group sold weapons of mass destruction to the Zhengfu army and sold some to the anti-government forces at low prices. Just like that, the two sides started fighting again. Hurricane Group had always been on Interpol's top blacklist. Gong Xiaoying and Gong Jia had always been at the top of the blacklist. However, with Hurricane Group's great influence and stable position, Interpol did not even have the ability to interfere. Hurricane Group was too powerful and had always been regarded as a thorn in the side of the various countries. However, no one could defeat it. The cargo ship sailed on the sea. Chu Ho stayed in the cabin. Outside the window, there were black men walking around. These were the Zhengfu army, responsible for escorting weapons. Part of North Africa used to be civilian land, so the official language was English. Chu Ho's English was first class. However, it was a special period now, so it was better not to walk around the cabin so as to avoid causing trouble. The journey at sea was especially slow. Every day was very torturous. After a short period of adaptation, Chu Ho overcame many obstacles. At first, she was not used to it. In addition, the food on the ship was difficult to describe in words. It was either potatoes or bread. It was extremely disgusting. However, no matter how disgusting it was, she had to swallow it. 5 days later, the ship finally arrived safely at the port. The port was located in the peace zone. When she landed, she heard that parts of the neutral zone had already fallen. There were countless casualties, and many areas had been occupied by anti-government forces. Hence, most of the Zhengfu army had already retreated from the neutral zone. As for the rest, most of them had probably been captured. War was especially cruel. A precious life in a war was no different from a bullet. In war, humanity was obliterated incisively and vividly. Soldiers, civilians, and even children who did not know the ways of the world, without exception, could not survive. She watched helplessly as a child was run over by a tank and was badly mutilated. She saw with her own eyes a soldier holding an AK gun and shooting at a helpless civilian. Their intestines and stomachs were torn apart. She also saw all kinds of corpses lying messily on the ground on the streets and in the wasteland. They were as lowly as ants. That was why she hated war. Abhorrence. Chapter 35:30. Chu Ho hired a driver from the front line for $100, some food and water, and successfully bribed him. Because of the outbreak of war, his family had lost their source of food. They even resorted to eating tree bark and soil to survive. Before the driver sent her to the front line, he went home and gave all the food to his wife and daughter. Then, he drove her to the front line. Along the way, the driver was curious why she wanted to go to the front line with such a big bag. At this time, even the Zhengfu army, including many unavoidably, could only think of ways to escape from the war zone. He found it strange to meet someone who wanted to go to the front line, so he asked curiously in broken English, "Are you a war correspondent?" "No." "Then why do you want to go to the front line?" "It's raining bullets there. There are anti-government troops and corpses everywhere. It's hell." The driver smiled and said, but I already sent 2 batches of war correspondents to the front line this morning. In the end, one of the correspondents was shot as soon as he got out of the car. I dragged him back. Luckily, he survived. When did the war break out? The driver sighed and said helplessly, a few days ago. Logically speaking, the neutral zone shouldn't have fallen. But because of the war between the two sides, the situation expanded. Coupled with the intervention of other countries, the neutral zone was about to fall. Now, has the neutral zone fallen? What about the personnel from the other countries? They've all evacuated. Do you know about the military factory in Worth? Worth? You're going to Worth? Yes. Worther has been shut down. All the factory workers have been dismissed. Many of the employees are locals. Those who can evacuate have already evacuated. Those who didn't manage to evacuate in time are trapped there. Chu Ho was speechless. She planned to go to Worth first, which was the Gu family's military factory. Then, she would follow the factory and search from other routes. Uncle Fu was also trying to contact Gu Jinglian. Although they had lost contact, they might be able to locate him. It started to rain heavily. From Tripoli to Sirte, it took more than 4 hours to drive along the coast. The road was muddy and overgrown with weeds. It was very difficult to walk. In the evening, the heavy rain made the road even more bumpy. In addition, there were no street lights, so it was pitch black ahead. One of the car's high-beam headlights was also broken, so it was difficult to illuminate the road ahead. The chauffeur suggested, "Why don't we make do for the night and leave when the sun rises?" "Are you tired?" "I'm not tired. At night, you won't be able to see the road ahead clearly. You might encounter an ambush. It's very dangerous." Chu Ho nodded in tacit agreement. On the way, they came across a rundown hotel. Chu Ho carried his bag and entered the hotel with the driver. When the owner saw the door being pushed open, he instinctively hid behind the counter, trembling in fear. In the past few days, there had been no end to the war. Many soldiers had come to rob the place. Because of this, everyone was on high alert. The driver quickly said, "We're not soldiers. They're civilians." The owner heaved a sigh of relief and said, "The hotel is closed. We have to pack up and leave tomorrow morning. This place is full of anti-government troops. How dare you come here?" Chapter 35-31. When the boss saw the money, he nodded and gave them the keys. Chu Ho and the driver were in 2 rooms. The hotel there was cheap, but the environment was quite bad. When she opened the door, she saw the dilapidated facilities. There were bullet holes on the wall from submachine gun shots. It was a scene of devastation. She locked the door from the inside and walked into the room. A foul smell assailed her nostrils. There was a musty smell on the bed. Chu Ho sniffed it. It was not hard to tell that it was a mixture of blood and sweat that had accumulated over a long period of time. There were no windows in the room and it was airtight. Hence, the musty smell was very strong. The bathroom was dirty and messy. However, it was better than sleeping outside. Chu Ho threw her bag on the bed and leaned against it. She hugged her chest and closed her eyes. In the middle of the night, there was a sudden movement at the door. She was always alert and immediately noticed the strange movements at the door. The lights were on in the room. She opened one eye gently and saw that the door was pushed open. 2 heads were moving around outside the door as if they were checking out the situation in the room. Chu Ho did not make a sound and pretended to be asleep. When the 2 people saw that she was asleep, they crept into the room quietly. When the 2 of them were exposed to the light, Chu Ho recognized them immediately. They were the driver and the boss. The 2 of them were communicating in the local dialect in a low voice. They knew that Chu Ho could understand English, so they communicated in the local dialect. However, they probably did not expect that Chu Ho, who often traveled in and out of North Africa, had a rough grasp of the local language. "This woman seems to be very rich. Do you see that bag?" It was the driver's voice. "I see a lot of food, water, and a lot of cash in the bag. How much is there? There must be tens of thousands of US dollars. Oh my God, the boss gasped. That's a big piece of meat. Chu-ho suddenly understood that the driver and the boss knew each other. Perhaps they were in cahoots. She went through the whole process. When they arrived, the driver took the initiative to ask to stay at a hotel for the night. As luck would have it, he ended up in this hotel. Many civilians in North Africa were very poor. Because of the war, they did not have fresh food reserves. Therefore, violent incidents of robbing Chinese shops were endless. The driver probably saw that she had money and a lot of food on her, so he had evil intentions. Chu-ho remained motionless. They did not realize that she was actually awake and thought that she was sleeping soundly. Therefore, they crept closer to the bed and saw that she was using her bag as a pillow. If he wanted to take her bag, he would definitely wake her up. The two of them exchanged glances. The driver signaled with his eyes and reminded them, "Kill her." The boss nodded and cocked his gun. However, his peripheral vision inadvertently fell on Chu-ho's face. He was shocked to find that her eyes had suddenly opened. Ah! Before he could let out a coherent cry of surprise, Chu-ho suddenly jumped up from the bed and clamped his legs around his neck. With a scissor kick, he flipped him onto the ground. When the driver saw this, he reached out to snatch her bag. Chu-ho sensed the movement behind her. She glanced at him coldly from the corner of her eye and gave him a roundhouse kick. The swift and fierce kick sent him to the ground. Chapter 35-32. The boss quickly picked up the gun and loaded it. He aimed the muzzle at her back and was about to pull the trigger. However, just as she pulled the trigger, Chu-hee had already heard the sound of a gun being loaded behind her. With a sudden somersault, she dodged the bullet before he could shoot. Before the person could react, she bounced up from the ground, jumped over the big bed, and kicked her wrist, sending the gun flying away. With a backhand, Chu-hee locked his arms behind his back. Looking around, she could not find any cloth strips, so she simply broke his wrist bones with two cracking sounds. The boss cried out in pain and wailed. The pain of having his bones dislocated caused his body to twitch violently. Chu-ho ignored his screams. She reached out to grab his jaw and dislocated it. She threw him aside and walked toward the driver. A minute later, the driver's joints were also dislocated and he was thrown beside the boss. Chu-ho walked in front of the two men and gently rubbed her wrists. She said coldly, "Who are you? Why did you attack me?" We, robbery?" Chu-ho narrowed her eyes dangerously. "Don't tell me you want to destroy the evidence?" The two of them were so frightened by her terrifying gaze that they immediately fell silent, not daring to say another word. Chu-ho couldn't be bothered with them. She squatted down. However, this action scared the driver so much that he screamed. It was as if he was worried that she would kill them at any moment. "Don't worry, I won't kill you." Chu-ho fumbled for the car keys from the driver's body. Then she stood up, picked up her combat bag, and turned to leave. The two men were left looking at each other with cold sweat all over their bodies. Chu-ho walked out of the hotel and parked the car at the entrance. In the rain, she could vaguely see the flames in the distance. That was probably the neutral zone that had fallen. She turned on the compass and got into the car. She threw her bag on the front passenger seat and got into the driver's seat. She started the car and drove slowly in the direction of the flames. In the rain, the air was humid. Chu-ho took out a bottle of water from his bag and drank it in one gulp. He opened the window and casually threw the empty bottle out. At night, coupled with the heavy rain, visibility was very low, so she drove very slowly. They were surrounded by low hills and sparse weeds, but there was not a single person in sight. Along the way, she encountered one or two corpses lying in the middle of the road. For safety reasons, she was not sure if there was a ditch or a landslide on the side of the road. Therefore, for safety reasons, she did not go around the corpses and directly ran over them. After driving for tens of kilometers, they saw a checkpoint. There were many vehicles parked at the checkpoint, as well as a very large oil tanker. They could vaguely see a few livestock. Because of the outbreak of war, many gas stations were destroyed. Therefore, the checkpoint became an important supply station. The oil price here was very cheap because the oil resources were very rich. A liter of oil that cost 6 yuan in China only cost 60 yuan here. Even a few loaves of bread could be exchanged for a tank of oil. Oil was cheap here, but food, fruits, and fresh water were extremely expensive. Especially at a time like this, an apple was priceless. Chapter 35-33. The car drove all the way to the neutral zone. There were a total of 5 countries in North Africa. However, the neutral zone in the center was Bilibid. It was also the most prosperous area in North Africa. This place was away from the Sahara Desert and was the golden zone of North Africa. Therefore, it relied on oil and many mineral resources and was very developed. Throughout history, North Africa had always been protected by famine and plague. At the same time, there was also invasion and smoke. The car finally arrived at the border of Bilibid. After passing a few checkpoints, they were all passed by using food and US dollars. When they entered Bilibid, the intensity of the war was even more visible. The originally bustling street was now quiet and empty. On the side of the street, there were messy piles of items and corpses. Just more than 10 hours ago, the war had affected the central area. On the road, her car was stopped many times. Once, it was directly stopped by the rebel army. Chu Ho saw that they had tanks and missiles, so she obediently stopped and allowed them to check. Chu Ho got out of the car and first showed her China passport. Now that the country was strong, with this passport, it became a foolproof pass. As long as she showed her passport, she would not be troubled. Then, Chu Ho stepped aside and let them check the car. However, there were only some daily necessities in the bag and nothing else was found. When she entered the territory, she threw away the pistol in advance because she knew that if she encountered the rebel army, they would stop the car and search it. If they found the pistol, it would be disadvantageous to her. As for the food and cash, Chu Ho would not let them search, so she hid them in other corners of the car in advance. Perhaps it was because of racial advantage, most of the people in Bilibid were black. With the suppression of intelligence, they were obviously very stupid. Therefore, they did not find any food, so they let her go. It was not that Chu Ho looked down on them. The intelligence of these soldiers could make her cry. When she arrived in Bilibid, it was already dawn. She found an international hotel and made do for the day. After resting for a few hours, she continued to advance toward the center of the war. The war spread to Bilibid, and many cities in Bilibid fell. The Worth factory was one of the few cities that fell. Worth was in Jamal, Bilibid, which was dozens of kilometers away from the capital of Bilibid. She rested well, filled up her fuel tank, and set off again until she reached the border of Jamal city. As night fell, she bypassed the checkpoint and entered the city through another gap. She was quite familiar with the terrain here, so she avoided many war zones along the way and avoided many unnecessary troubles. After entering Jamal, the entire city was shrouded in the shadow of death. Smoke filled the air as the flames of war swirled in the air. Even at night, Chu-hee could still see many refugees hugging their dead or injured relatives and crying in despair as she walked along the streets. Blood flowed like a river on the road. One could imagine how intense the battle was during the day. Hell on earth, city of despair. The embassy was located in the city center of Jamal, right next to the government building. Chu Ho relied on his memory to refer to the road signs and found the government building. However, he was shocked to see that the government building had been bombarded until it was on the verge of collapse. On the wall, there was a huge hole, mottled with blood, and the glass door had been bombed into pieces. There were countless casualties at the door, and there were piles of corpses that had not been cleaned up in time. Chapter 35-34. Even in the midst of war, in the fallen North Africa, whether it was the government or the rebel army, no one dared to touch the embassy. It was originally a local war. If the embassy was invaded, it would undoubtedly mean that the war had escalated to an international level. Chu-ho parked the car at the door, pushed the door open, and walked in. In the darkness, just as she pushed the door open, her combat boots stepped on a soft corpse. Then, in the pitch-black silence, she vaguely heard the sound of a gun being loaded. She immediately raised her hands calmly and said loudly in English, "I'm Chinese. I'm not carrying any weapons." Pa, a beam of high beam shone toward her. The strong light fell on her face and blinded her. Chu-ho calmly accepted the inspection until it was confirmed that she was a real Chinese. Finally, a light in the hall was turned on. Under the light, Chu-ho saw that countless Chinese had gathered together and were curled up in a corner, staring at her in fear. Chu-ho was shocked. She did not expect that there were still so many Chinese who had not evacuated. "Why are you still here?" "Because the evacuation fleet has already evacuated. The next batch will only arrive in 3 days. The people in the embassy have all evacuated. We're all here waiting for rescue. Yeah, we don't dare to go out because the embassy is our last refuge. If we go out, those bullets have no eyes. It's very dangerous." It turned out that there were still many Chinese factory employees who did not manage to evacuate in time. Therefore, many people rushed into the embassy. Amidst the flames of war, the current embassy was like a refuge, as well as the last protective harbor. Although those people did not dare to invade the embassy, there were often some crazy rebels who did not care about the identity of the Chinese. They burned, killed, and robbed the stores and supermarkets opened by the Chinese. They even went to the embassy and robbed the food and water. Although it would not hurt their lives, the next batch of rescue fleet would only arrive at the port in 3 days. In other words, they had to hold on for more than 4 days. There were a lot of people, hundreds of people. Food and water were very limited. They had handed over all the cash they had. However, they could not afford food and water. Otherwise, with so many people, they could not last 4 days. Therefore, even if they were in the embassy, they did not dare to turn on the lights. They were worried that the rebels would see the light source and rush in to rob them. This place had already been robbed once and a few people were injured. Therefore, they did not dare to turn on the lights. Chu-ho heard that, frowned and asked, "In other words, the country will send another ship to take care of your evacuation?" "Yes." Then, Chu-ho took a step forward and asked, "Are there any of Werther's men here?" After a long time, a man in orange uniform stood up slowly and asked in surprise, "You're looking for Werther's men?" "Yes." Chapter 35:35. After he said this, the others were obviously trembling in fear. When Chu-ho heard this, he frowned. He had an ominous feeling in his heart. If Werther was controlled by the people of Hurricane, then what about Gu Jinglian? She scanned the crowd but did not find him. Such an eye-catching man, even if he was thrown into the crowd, he would be found at a glance. Even if she did not find him, he would stand up and show himself when he saw her. But she did not see him. This meant that he was not here. Chu-ho asked again, "You said that all of Werther's employees are here?" The man hurriedly explained, "No, only 2/3 of them are here. The other 1/3, more than 100, are trapped in the war zone." When they left Werther, the rebel army had already taken over the entire villa. That area has been sealed off by the rebel army. It's the center of the war. I'm going to find someone now. Chu-ho said again, "His name is Gu Jinglian. Where is he now? Is he also trapped in the war zone?" Everyone was shocked and looked at each other. The man asked in surprise, "Gu Jinglian, isn't that our boss?" "Yes, CEO Gu, why are you looking for our boss?" Chu-ho said, "He's my husband. I heard that North Africa has fallen, so I came here to look for him." Chu-ho stood up straight and looked around. He said calmly, "I need someone who is familiar with the terrain of Jamal to take me to the war zone to look for someone. Is anyone willing to come with me?" "Don't go." The man immediately said, "Miss, I don't know if what you said is true. At least, I've never heard of our boss having a wife. The problem is that the war zone is now full of rebel soldiers. The streets are full of corpses and soldiers. If you go there rashly, you're not looking for someone, you're looking for death. Moreover, all of Werther's people who can come out have already come out. The rest are trapped in the middle of the war. I'm afraid their lives are uncertain. The hope of survival is very slim. If you go now, you'll be wasting your life. My man is not so weak. Your man won't die so easily. Chu Ho, on the other hand, was very confident in Gu Jinglian. Now, there was no news. That was enough to prove that he was still alive. As long as she was alive, she had a reason to take risks. No one dares to go with you. The man had a timid expression on his face as he trembled and said, "Those rebels are too cruel. No matter who they saw, Caucasian, Chinese, or civilian, they killed them all." What did that mean? If they went there now, they would die. It wasn't easy for us to escape from Worth. We won't risk our lives again. He did not force him to make his stance clear and resolute. After all, being afraid of death seemed to be a human instinct. After experiencing despair, the desire to survive grew stronger. "All right, I'll go by myself." Chu Ho had just turned around when a young man's calm voice came from behind him. "I'll go with you." Chapter 35-36. He spoke fluent Chinese and walked up to her. "I grew up in Jamal, so I'm very familiar with the place. I'll go with you." Chu Ho was a little surprised. She looked behind him and asked, "Where are your parents?" He said that he wanted to go. Perhaps he was naive, but wouldn't his parents stop him? The young man's eyes darkened, and his voice weakened. "My parents are already dead." Chu Ho was stunned. The young man pursed his lips, but he didn't cry. He gritted his teeth and said, "They were killed by the rebels." Chu Ho smiled. "Aren't you afraid?" The young man shook his head and said firmly, "I'm not afraid. Anyway, my father is gone, my mother is gone, and my sister." He gritted his teeth and closed his eyes. "They're gone too. I'm alone. There's nothing to be afraid of." Chu Ho seemed to see herself when she was young. In the war, her family was destroyed, and her heart was filled with hatred and helplessness. She smiled and held out her hand to him. "You're so brave. Okay, come with me, but I'll protect you." The young man nodded, held her hand, and followed her out of the embassy, leaving the crowd looking at each other. When Chu Ho left the embassy, she was very cautious. She looked around and made sure that there was no one around before she opened the car door and told the young man to get in and fasten his seatbelt. She quickly got into the car, started the car, and drove in the direction of Werther. "There's no one in Werther now. My father is a worker in Weert." A few days ago, Weert was occupied by a large group of armed men. According to the other uncles, they're from the Hurricane Group, not the rebel army. However, they seem to be very powerful. So many Chinese factories were smashed and robbed by the rebel army, but Weert was the only one left unscathed. Hurricane, Chu Ho narrowed her eyes. Uncle Fu said that Hurricane Group used her and Xiao Bao to threaten Gu Jinglian to sign the agreement. He had to give up Werther and that piece of land. The losses were heavy. She still couldn't figure out why Gu Jinglian did that. Was it because of her? Was he protecting her? Thinking of this possibility, Chu Ho suddenly laughed at himself. How could this be? This man had always been arrogant and self-righteous. How could he give up such a huge benefit just to protect her? The young man continued, "It's very dangerous to drive to Werther now. However, from what I know, there are many China factories in the war zone. Those factories are all state-owned enterprises, so the rebels don't dare to touch them. Some people might be hiding there. Where do we go?" The young man pointed at the road sign in front of them. "Go to that junction and head south. You are really familiar with the terrain." The young man nodded. "I grew up here." "Then how do you speak Chinese so well?" "That's because my parents are both from China, and I'm also from China. Of course, I have to speak Chinese, but I also know a little English. If my parents were still alive, with our passports, We would be able to catch up with the first batch of evacuation ships. At this point, the youth fell silent again. She probably thought of something sad again. His parents were shot to death because they were trying to protect him, those damned rebels. They deserved to die for being so cruel and merciless. Chu-ho patted her head and smiled. Don't be sad. It's all in the past. Chapter 35-37. By the way, what's your name? My name is Lin Shi. Lin Shi. That's a nice name. When they reached the intersection, Lin Shi suddenly said, let's take the small path. I know a shortcut. Needless to say, Chu-ho did not dare to drive the car on the main street. She knew that there must be a lot of troops stationed there. Therefore, she followed Lin Shi's directions and drove to the small path. The so-called small path was extremely bumpy and difficult to walk on. The small path in the forest was a muddy path cultivated by the local people. It was not the road paved with cement. With this opening, it was dawn again. Chu-ho did not dare to rest. Although it was dangerous to drive when tired, this was the wild forest. There were wild beasts everywhere. Jackals, lions, cheetahs. It was very dangerous. She drove all the way to the factory that Lin Shi had pointed out. After getting out of the car, she looked around and confirmed that there was no danger before letting Lin Shi get out of the car. At the entrance of the factory, there was no one. There was no sign of life at all. Chu-ho took out the pistol from her waist belt and loaded it. She looked around vigilantly. Her left hand held Lin Shi's hand tightly until they walked into the factory. She pushed the door open. Under the moonlight, it was full of dust. Lin Shi waved his hand and coughed a few times. Chu-ho quickly covered his mouth and shushed him. Don't make a sound. Lin Shi nodded and obediently shut his mouth. He did not make a sound. Chu-ho pushed the door open and walked in. She took out the night vision goggles from her bag and put them on. With this, she could clearly see the terrain even in the dark. Suddenly, two figures appeared in her line of sight. They were hiding behind the wall. They were local black people with guns in their hands. Although they were black, it was difficult to recognize them in the dark. However, Chu-ho's night vision goggles had thermal imaging. Therefore, she saw them at a glance. She immediately stopped in her tracks and said in the local language, "We are not rebels." The black people did not expect her to notice them. They looked at each other but were still vigilant. They tightened their grip on the guns in their hands. Chu-ho did not move forward. Instead, she took half a step back and put away her pistol. She slowly raised her hands to show her sincerity. Don't worry. You are very safe. I won't hurt you. Only then did the few black civilians let down their guard and turn on a lamp. Under the light, Chu-he was surprised to find that all the factory employees and civilians who had run over to hide were hiding on the second floor. They looked down nervously. When they saw that it was a woman and a child who came without any armed forces, they let down their guard. Who are you? My husband is. Chu-he asked again, are there any Weirts? Is. CEO. The man became even more suspicious. Why haven't I heard that President Gu has a wife? We just got married not long ago. Chu-ho saw that he did not believe her, so she provided a few more private information about the Gu family and the Gu Corporation. Finally, the man believed her, but he looked very guilty. Chapter 35-38. It turned out that after Hurricane took over Weird, all the higher-ups of Weird wanted to cover Gu Jinglian's escape as soon as possible. Unfortunately, they were ambushed by the rebel army and had no choice but to split up. After that, there was no news of Gu Jinglian. When Chu-ho heard this, he frowned. When we split up, how many people did Gu Jinglian have? About 30 people. 5 of them were mercenaries. They were very strong. That means someone is protecting him. Yes. Then from what you can see, where could he be now? The man was suddenly in a dilemma. Since you're asking, I can't say. Jamal is not big, but it's not small either. It has a radius of 100 miles. All the communication towers have been disconnected. CEO Gu doesn't have a satellite phone with him, so we can't contact him. But I'm guessing that they won't be too far away. After all, the neutral zone has fallen. It's too chaotic outside. CEO Gu and the rest should have found a place to hide. Now, other than some of the armed forces, no one else can enter. Waiting for rescue? Who are they waiting for? I heard that everyone in the embassy has evacuated. Some of the Chinese citizens haven't. But the fleet should be here soon. I'm guessing that they'll be heading in the direction of the embassy. Chu Ho immediately interrupted him and said, "The embassy is now sealed off. There are rebel forces outside. It's a war zone. It's very dangerous to walk to the embassy." The man was puzzled. "How did you get in?" Car. That person turned pale with fright. "You just drove your car in so openly?" "There are so many checkpoints and they're all occupied by the rebel army. I didn't pass through the checkpoints. I walked through the small path." Chu Ho paused and suddenly sighed. "But the car is out of gas now." "Do you have gas here?" "We do." "Are you going to look for CEO Gu now?" The man said with a headache, "You can't do it during the day. At night, the war zone stops. During the day, it's chaotic outside. It's too dangerous. Why don't you stay here and rest for the night? When night falls, you can go out and look for him. It's not too late." Chu Ho nodded. "I know." She lowered her head and said to Lin Shi, "Let's rest here for the night." "Yes." Chu Ho and Lin Shi went to the second floor and found a corner. There was no bed, only a mat, and they lay down. At this time, the weather was already a little cold. Just lying on the mat without any shelter, it was inevitable that it would be a bit cold. Lin Shi curled up in a corner, shivering from the cold. Suddenly, a coat covered his body. Lin Shi turned his head and saw that Chu Ho had taken off his thick coat and covered him with it. She only had a combat vest on her body, which was very thin. Lin Shi's heart warmed. He was a little touched, but he asked uneasily, "Aren't you cold?" "It's not cold. I'm used to it." She had experienced even more difficult environments. Compared to the time when she had to walk in the humid rainforest, this environment paled in comparison. She lay down, but from the corner of her eye, she saw Lin Shi move closer to her. He covered her with his clothes and hugged her tightly. Chapter 35-39. Chu Ho also closed her eyes. Perhaps she was too tired from rushing through the night and the high intensity of her mental strength, so she fell asleep immediately. He actually fell into a deep sleep. When she woke up again, she was called by Lin Shi. Chu Ho opened her eyes and saw the black muzzle of a gun. The hole in the distance was emitting cold air. Almost instinctively, she grabbed the gun at her waist. However, the next second, a bayonet was right in front of her. She recognized the gun. It was an AK-47 equipped with a sharp triangular bayonet. The body of the bayonet was ridged. It was a three-sided bayonet with 3 blood grooves. This meant that when the bayonet pierced into the human body, it would rapidly increase the bleeding through the blood grooves on the 3 sides. The muscles would contract and be unable to adhere to the surface of the bayonet. The wound would appear as a square hole and would not be able to stop the bleeding and heal. This meant that such a wound could not be treated immediately. If there was too much bleeding, it would be fatal. Moreover, in such an environment, once the bayonet pierced through, it would be fatal. Chu Ho looked at the gun and saw that the person holding the gun was a black man wearing tattered clothes but a red headscarf. She immediately recognized that this was the rebel army. The bayonet was only an inch away from her glabella. Even if he did not make a move, she would be stabbed in the glabella if she moved slightly. Chu Ho quickly calmed down. From the corner of her eye, she saw Lin Shi kneeling on the ground with his head in his hands. Looking from afar, downstairs, a large group of black men with red headscarves were standing in the middle of the field with guns in their hands. Rows of civilians were kneeling on the ground with their heads in their hands, trembling. Chu-ho suddenly realized that this place had been invaded by the rebel army. She let go of the pistol and raised her hands, indicating that she should give up resisting. Another black man walked over and took the gun from her waist. Then, he grabbed her collar and threw her to the middle of the field. In just a short time, she had a preliminary understanding of the current situation. Yesterday at the bottom of the road, the path she had taken to get here was all muddy. The car left deep tire marks along the way. These marks probably attracted the rebel army's attention. They followed the traces and followed all the way here, exposing this shelter. Chu-ho was dragged all the way downstairs. Everyone glared at her angrily. Her arrival had also attracted the rebel army. They originally had a chance to hide in the rescue team, but now, this place was exposed by her, implicating so many people. Chu-ho was thrown into the middle of the field. He questioned, "Whose car is this?" She remained silent. The car was locked, so these people smashed the car window and found her combat bag. They found a lot of things and found the documents in the bag. So, they suspected that the owner of the car was a spy from the government who came to investigate. Chu-ho did not say anything. She couldn't admit it. Moreover, there was a lot of cash, food, and fresh water in the car. If she admitted it, they would definitely take away her car keys, open the car, and rob all the food inside. The rebel soldiers saw that the entire place was silent. They searched the crowd and suddenly walked into the crowd and pulled Lin Shi out. He was the youngest child present. The soldier directly flipped over an oil barrel from the side, opened the cap, and directly poured the oil all over him. Chapter 35-40. Lin Shi hugged his body tightly, but he did not beg for mercy. He knelt on the ground and looked up. His eyes were filled with hatred as he stared at the soldiers. He knew that the car belonged to Chu-ho, but he did not say anything. The soldier lit a match and waved it. He threatened, "I'll ask again. Whose car is this?" Everyone was so nervous that they could not say a coherent sentence. However, many of them glanced at Chu-ho as if they were signaling something to the soldiers. At this critical juncture, they naturally wanted to save their own lives. The lives of others were not important. The soldiers looked at Chu-ho suspiciously. When Chu-ho saw this, he could no longer remain silent. He suddenly said, "This is my car. It has nothing to do with this child." Lin Shi looked at him in surprise. He was deeply moved. "Hand over the car keys." Chu-ho took a deep breath. He calmly took out the keys from his trouser pocket and threw them to them. When the soldier saw this, he sneered and threw the lit match at Lin Shi. At this moment, his body was covered in gasoline. If the match landed beside him, he would definitely die. Lin Shi closed his eyes in despair. Chu-ho reacted quickly and leaped toward Lin Shi. At the same time, seeing that she had suddenly stood up, the vigilant soldier raised his gun and pulled the trigger. The bullet pierced through the air and brushed past her waist. It passed through the bullets and hit a man behind Chu-ho, piercing his thigh. He cried out in pain and hugged his thigh as he twitched. There was no fire as expected. Lin Shi opened her eyes in disbelief, only to see Chu-ho pouncing on her. In her palm, she caught the matchstick tightly and snapped it into two. The skin on her palm was scalded, and it was a shocking red. Chu-ho pulled him into his arms and said solemnly, "I promised you that I would protect you. I have to keep my word." Lin Shi's eyes flickered and tears flowed out. A few soldiers raised their guns and aimed at Chu-ho. Chu-ho turned around and shielded Lin Shi behind him. He said word by word, "There's cash and food in the car. I hid them in a place. Use these to exchange for this child's life. Take us there. If you let this child go, I'll tell you." The soldiers looked at each other before putting away their guns. Chu-ho immediately said to Lin Shi, "Quickly find a place to hide." Lin Shi shook his head and said firmly, "I want to be with you." "Be good, I'm fine. Find a place to hide, okay? No matter what happens, don't come out." Lin, she wavered a little. Gritting his teeth, he stood up and walked a few steps. Seeing that the soldiers seemed to have tacitly agreed to let him go, he ran into the warehouse, found a secret room, and hid himself. Chu Ho stood up and covered his wound. He followed the soldiers out of the factory and to the parking lot. Where are the money and things? Chu Ho pretended to be in pain and said with difficulty, it's in the secret compartment of the armrest. Take it out. I'm injured, Chu Ho said with difficulty, I don't have any strength, be honest. Two soldiers opened the car door and went into the car to rummage through it. Chu Ho narrowed his eyes and looked around. There were a total of 4 soldiers here. 2 of them went into the car to look for things. Their backs were facing him, so they couldn't see his every move. Chapter 35-41. Chu Ho kicked the 2 soldiers into the car and locked the door. Her smooth movements were completed within a few seconds. Before the other 2 soldiers could react, Chu Ho flashed behind them. Just as they raised their pistols to aim at her, Chu Ho grabbed that person's arm and twisted it hard. She aimed at his elbow joint and heard a "kacha" sound as the joint fell off. She lifted her leg and kicked him a few meters away. Chu Ho snatched the gun and casually fired 2 shots at the other soldier who was about to pull the trigger. In an instant, that person's glabella was shot and he fell to the ground. The soldier who was kicked away struggled to get up from the ground. He pulled out a tri-edge army knife from his waist and waved it at her. Chu Ho dodged nimbly and took the opportunity to raise her fist and hit him hard on the nose. The most vulnerable parts of a person's face were the eyes and the bridge of the nose. Her punch directly broke that person's nose. The soldier held onto his bleeding nose and howled in pain. However, before he could shout out a coherent sentence, Chu Ho's ghostly figure flashed behind him and locked his neck from behind. She exerted strength in her arm and broke his throat. These 2 pitiful soldiers, until they died, did not expect that this frail-looking woman would have such powerful skills. They were afraid of her because she had a weapon on her and were worried that she was from some military unit or the government army. However, no one would have thought that her skills were comparable to the top mercenaries. The 2 soldiers in the car saw this scene and knew that this woman's skills were definitely not something they could win against. Hence, they frantically honked the car horn, hoping that the sound would attract the attention of the other soldiers in the factory. Chu Ho became alert. She suddenly walked to the front of the car and held onto the edge of the car roof. She then kicked the mailbox at the bottom of the car. She was wearing combat boots that were equipped with a short blade. With a kick, a dent appeared in the fuel tank. She kicked again fiercely and the sharp short blade directly cut a hole in the fuel tank. A stream of air flowed into the fuel tank. She turned around and plunged into the bushes at the side. The soldiers in the factory heard the sound of the horn and hurriedly armed themselves. They carried their submachine guns and rushed out. However, when they walked out of the door, they saw that there was no one around. It was dead silent. They glanced at the car and saw 2 corpses lying beside it. The leader took a look and his expression turned cold. He walked over and grabbed one of the corpses by the collar to check his breathing. He was already dead. What happened? Where was that woman? The 2 soldiers in the car kept hitting the window. The leader walked over, bent his arm and broke the window with his elbow. The 2 soldiers tried to climb out of the car window. However, the leader immediately signaled them to keep quiet. He could vaguely hear the sound of dripping. It was especially clear in this quiet night. The leader looked around and suddenly realized that the sound was coming from the bottom. He squatted down and was surprised to see that there was a pool of oil on the floor of the room, giving off a pungent smell of petrol. There was a hole in the fuel tank and petrol was leaking all over the floor. Chapter 35-42. Before he could make a run for it, Chu-hee narrowed her eyes and pulled the trigger from the bushes. Bang! A bullet whizzed through the air. Boom! The bullet accurately hit the fuel tank. The fuel tank was already on the verge of exploding when it came into contact with the oxygen. With the ignition of the gasoline and the sparks from the bullet, a strong explosion occurred in an instant. The entire vehicle exploded, and the flames soared into the sky. The powerful shockwave was like an avalanche, sweeping everyone to the ground. A row of soldiers who couldn't dodge in time were instantly swallowed up by the flames. The flames almost lit up half the night sky. The violent explosion was deafening. Chu-ho was also pushed to the ground by the blast. She crawled on the ground until the blast subsided. Then she got up and slowly walked out of the bushes. She glanced at the volcanic sea of fire and turned to walk back to the factory. One of them was pushed to the side by the blast and vomited blood. In his blurry vision, he struggled to support his body, raised his hand, and shot at her abdomen. Pfft! Chu-ho felt as if her abdomen had been hit by something. Immediately after, she felt a burning pain and a terrifying wound appeared on her abdomen. She clutched her bleeding abdomen and staggered. She knelt on the ground on one knee. When she turned around, she saw the soldier fall to the ground heavily and take his last breath. She struggled to stand. At first, she did not feel anything when she was shot. However, after taking a step, she could not stand anymore. She swayed and fell to the ground. The pain was so intense that she broke out in a cold sweat. Chu-ho struggled to support her body. She immediately tore the vest on her body and pressed on the wound to squeeze out the blood clots. The dagger was tied to the back of her waist. The bullet accurately pierced through the dagger and embedded itself in her skin. Fortunately, the dagger blocked the bullet and did not penetrate too deeply. However, the pain was that the dagger was penetrated. The metal skin stuck to the wound, and the pain was heart-wrenching. Chu-ho crawled to the side of the tree with great difficulty and knelt on the ground. Biting his collar tightly, he tied the cloth around his wound and pulled out the dagger. After disinfecting it with fire, he endured the pain and made a cross on the wound. Then, he pulled out the bullet with his bare hands. The excruciating pain caused her to break out in a cold sweat. She closed her eyes, disinfected the wound, and bandaged it. She took out some cotton wool from her trousers and roughly bandaged the wound. It hurt so much that he was confused. She held on to the tree trunk and stood up. However, she only felt the world before her eyes turned dark. Her entire back seemed to have lost all feeling. It was numb, and only pain was constantly transmitted to her. Chu-ho could no longer stand steadily and fainted. Before she closed her eyes, she vaguely saw a few black soldiers running towards her. They were holding their guns and staring at her. When she woke up again, she was splashed with a basin of salt water. The salt water flowed directly into her wound, and she woke up in pain. Hiss! Chu-ho opened her eyes abruptly. The salt water flowed into her eyes, and it was bitter and painful. Immediately after, her wrists were tightly bound and her toes were off the ground. These reminded her that she was hanging from a tree branch. A few black soldiers pointed their guns at her. One of them, who was holding a red headscarf, pointed at her and asked in the local language, "Who are you? Did you kill these brothers?" Chapter 35-43. When the man saw this, he was so angry that he kicked her. Chu-ho's body slammed into a thick tree trunk. She was in so much pain that she couldn't scream. "Speak." Chu-ho sneered and said contemptuously, "I'm not from the government." The leader didn't believe her at all. He was certain that Chu-ho was a mercenary sent by the government or an intelligence agent from some organization. It was because of this that Chu-ho didn't bother to explain. Anyway, even if she said she wasn't and revealed her identity, they might not believe her. Chu-ho heard someone ask, "Captain, how should we deal with this person?" In her daze, she only heard the leader say, "Behead her as an example to the public." Beheading was the most common method used by terrorists. Perhaps the people who lived in peaceful countries couldn't understand this method. The so-called beheading mentioned by these rebels was to tie the person's hands and feet and make them kneel on the ground. Then, they would use a very blunt butcher's knife to cut the throat bit by bit. Rather than beheading, it was more like cutting the throat. As the victim wouldn't die immediately, he would be able to see clearly how his throat was cut. Hence, this method of death was especially painful. Hence, the blade was very blunt. It was to make the victims suffer as much pain as possible to promote martial arts. When Chu-ho heard this, she didn't show much fear on her face. She was pushed to the ground. A soldier grabbed her hair and forced her to kneel on the ground. Then, he took out a small rusty knife from behind him and slowly pressed it against her neck. Chu-ho could feel the cold blade against her skin. She slowly closed her eyes. However, the expected pain didn't come. Vaguely, she felt the hand that was grabbing her loosening its grip, and the knife fell to the ground. Immediately after, hot scarlet blood fell onto her shoulder and soaked her clothes. Chu-hee woke up at once and looked up in surprise, only to be met with a lifeless face. The soldier's eyes were wide open. He was attacked from behind. A sharp triangular military knife almost pierced his heart. He fell weakly on top of her. Chu-ho couldn't bear it anymore and fell to the ground. Bang, bang, bang. She immediately recognized that it was the sound of a gun. The barrel of the cloud shot gun was very thick, and the diameter of the muzzle was at most 20 millimeters. It had a lot of firepower and was very wide. It was a weapon with terrifying explosive power in close combat. If a bullet were to hit a human body, the wound would explode and expand, resulting in a one-hit kill. If the gun was fired at close range, the bullet could directly send a person flying. Chu-ho fell to the ground. He vaguely saw a particularly tall man, fully armed, with 3 pistols on his back and 2 rows of bullets on his shoulder. He held a gun and agilely dodged the soldiers' attacks. None of the bullets missed. In just a short moment, more than a dozen soldiers present were shot and fell to the ground. Just then, a child ran to her side and patted her face gently. He asked nervously, "Sister, are you okay?" Chu-ho looked up and met Lin Shi's anxious eyes. "It's you?" "Yes." Lin Shi dragged her to the front of a tree and used a dagger to cut the rope that tied her up. However, he found the wound on her abdomen and frowned in pain. "How are you? Are you okay? You're injured." Chapter 35-44. "Didn't I tell you to hide?" Lin Shi said, "There's a secret passage behind the factory. I escaped through that secret passage. I followed the clues you provided and found the person you were talking about. Gu Jinglian. Is that his name?" Chu-ho was stunned. She could not help but look at the man. In the night, the man put away his gun and checked the corpses on the ground one by one. If he found someone who was still alive, he would kill him directly. He stood up and turned around. His handsome and heroic face came into her sight. "Gu," she opened her mouth and widened her eyes in disbelief. She did not expect him to appear. Gu Jinglian strode over and squatted in front of her. As he moved, the bullets on his body made a tinkling sound. He was wearing a combat uniform and a thick bulletproof vest. His limbs were tied with guns, ammunition, and all kinds of cold weapons. After leaving Werther, he took away all the equipment, guns, ammunition, and bulletproof vests. He was fully armed. He killed his way out of Werther. He led his men and horses and wanted to kill his way out of the fallen area. However, he did not expect to meet a child who was almost attacked on the way. Initially, he was too lazy to care. However, for some reason, he suddenly thought of Xiao Bao. He did not know why, but he saved the child. The child who was saved grabbed him and asked nervously where someone was going. Coincidentally, he was the person the child was looking for. The child said that a young sister came to North Africa to look for him and was now in danger. He asked who it was, but the child could not tell him the name. He only said that it was a very powerful person. He immediately thought of Chu-ho. However, why would she appear here? It was unbelievable. On the way here, he saw a person hanging on a tree branch at the entrance of the factory. He recognized her at a glance. He secretly ambushed and shot a few soldiers. Gu Jinglian looked at Chu-ho nervously. When he saw the wound on her abdomen that was roughly bandaged, he was stunned. "You're injured?" "I'm fine. I was shot." "What about the bullet? Did you take it out?" Take, as Chu-ho spoke, she tried to support her body and stand up. However, she overestimated herself. Just as she stood up, she knelt on the ground due to exhaustion. Gu Jinglian reached out and supported her. Seeing that she was seriously injured, his tone became cold. "Why are you here?" I came to find you." Halfway through his words, Chu Ho could no longer make a sound. His eyelids twitched violently, and he actually fainted. Gu Jinglian caught her nimbly and pulled her into his arms. His face was full of heartache. This stupid woman actually found her way here. Looking for him? He was clearly courting death. He was a little angry. What kind of place was this? It was such a chaotic place, filled with the flames of war, smoke, and endless disputes. Only people wanted to escape, but she actually rushed here rashly. Crazy? His heart ached as he hugged her tightly, as though he was afraid that she would vanish into thin air in his arms. He frowned and said, "Crazy woman. What should we do?" "Lin," she asked anxiously, "will sister be okay? Let's go back to the base first and check on her injuries." "Okay." As Lin she spoke, he was about to carry Chu Ho. However, Gu Jinglian was one step ahead of him. He carried Chu Ho with one hand and held a gun with the other, ready to deal with any sudden attack. Chapter 35-45. Lin Shi was shocked. He didn't expect this man to be strong enough to carry a woman with one hand. It was too terrifying. Although Chu Ho was very thin, she was still quite tall. He actually carried her with one hand and his expression didn't change at all. Gu Jinglian carried her and turned around, only to see that Lin Shi was still in a daze. He frowned and said coldly, "Follow me." Oh. Okay. Lin Shi immediately chased after him. The three of them walked all the way and arrived at a bomb shelter. Gu Jinglian was originally with the main group, but because Lin Shi appeared along the way, he came with him to look for Chu Ho. As a result, they lost contact with the main group. They had originally planned to go to the signal tower to restore the broken signal and then contact for backup. Now that they had parted ways and Chu Ho was injured, Gu Jinglian planned to find a place to hide and treat her wound. It was dark and damp in the bomb shelter. Gu Jinglian placed Chu Ho in a relatively dry place. He turned around and instructed Lin Shi, "Bring the gauze and iodine over." Lin Shi carried Chu Ho's combat bag over. He rummaged through the bag for the iodine and gauze and passed them to Gu Jinglian. Gu Jinglian untied the gauze and checked the wound. There was an obvious gunshot wound on her waist and abdomen. There was a cross on the wound, but there was no bullet shell. The bullet had been removed. Gu Jinglian was very surprised. This cross was probably made by removing the bullet. Who did it? Could it be that she did it herself? How did she do it? A woman actually had such terrifying willpower when she was injured by a gunshot. She could actually remove the bullet by herself. However, because of the circumstances, the wound was not well treated. If it was dragged out, it could easily become infected. Gu Jinglian disinfected the wound with iodine. After cleaning it thoroughly, he stopped the bleeding. He covered the wound with a clean gauze and bandaged it. It was especially painful to clean the wound. Chu Ho woke up from the pain. She hissed and opened her eyes. Her beautiful eyebrows were slightly furrowed. Gu Jinglian glanced at her. "Does it hurt?" Chu Ho nodded and his breathing quickened. "Yes, a little." Gu Jinglian said, "Bear with it. If the wound was not treated properly, it could easily become infected and inflamed." After he bandaged the wound, Chu Ho finally closed his eyes and his breathing gradually stabilized. Gu Jinglian suddenly asked, "Why are you here?" Chu Ho furrowed her brows, but a strange blush appeared on her face. She turned her face away, not looking at his face, and did not say a word for a long time. She had her pride. She could not possibly tell Gu Jinglian that she risked her life to come to such a war-torn area to look for him because she was worried. It was even more impossible for her to say that she was worried that something would happen to him or that Xiao Bao would lose his father. Now that she saw that he was safe, her heart was at ease. Gu Jinglian saw that she did not speak. Her pale face only had a slight blush on it. It was extremely strange. He asked suspiciously, "Are you worried about me?" "No." Chu-ho almost reflexively interrupted him. She said coldly, "Do you think I'm here for you?" Gu Jinglian was speechless. Wasn't that the case? Wasn't her words just giving herself away? Chapter 35-46. Chu-ho saw that her words weren't convincing and said expressionlessly, "I came here just to what? To play." Gu Jinglian was speechless. Play. Now that the war was raging and most of North Africa had fallen into the flames of war, she came here, to play? Gu Jinglian said calmly, stubborn. Chu-ho heard this but didn't want to talk to him. She then realized that she was in Gu Jinglian's arms and they were very close to each other. The intimacy between the two of them was unreasonable and she was instantly alarmed. You don't have to hug me." "Oh." Gu Jinglian didn't say anything else and let go of her. Chu-ho fell to the ground and stretched her wound, causing her to frown in pain. She immediately rushed over anxiously and said to Gu Jinglian angrily, "Hey! Why aren't you gentlemanly at all? Sister is injured." Gu Jinglian said calmly, "She said she didn't want me to hug her." Lin Shishan added, "Women always say one thing and mean another. She might say she doesn't want you to hug her, but she probably wants you to hug her." Chu-ho couldn't take it anymore. She grimaced and said, "I didn't say that." She pouted and hurriedly asked worriedly, "Sister, are you all right? Does your wound hurt?" Chu-ho groaned and said angrily, "It doesn't hurt." Gu Jinglian glanced at her lightly and pulled her into his arms again. Chu-ho struggled a little unnaturally, but Gu Jinglian's voice became gentler. He patted her back gently and said calmly, "All right, stop talking." Chu-ho stopped talking. "Don't worry. Go to sleep." Gu Jinglian said again, "Have a good sleep. We'll continue our journey when we wake up." She nodded and suddenly asked curiously, "Where are we going?" Chu-ho asked curiously, "How are we going to leave later? How do we leave North Africa? There is a signal base station more than 10 miles away from here. My men and I have agreed to meet at the signal tower. When the signal is restored, we will contact my rescue team stationed in North Africa. By then, we will be able to leave this place." When Chu-ho heard this, he grunted and closed his eyes. She was really tired, so she fell asleep immediately. Gu Jinglian couldn't help but smile when he heard her breathing. He lowered his eyes and gently planted a kiss on her forehead. How could he not know why Chu-ho had come? Although she was stubborn and did not mean what she said, for a woman who did not hesitate to brave the flames of war to come to North Africa and get injured all over, who did she do it for? However, even though she was stubborn and refused to say anything, he was kind enough to not expose her. She also found a place to lie down. After going through so many things, he was already extremely tired, so he quickly fell asleep. Gu Jinglian also closed his eyes. The air raid shelter was very remote. Moreover, before entering the shelter, he had deliberately buried landmines at the entrance. If an enemy entered, it would definitely trigger the mechanism, giving him a lot of time to react. Gu Jinglian hugged Chu-ho tightly and also fell asleep. The three of them curled up in the air raid shelter. When Chu-ho woke up again, the sky outside the shelter was gradually darkening. Chapter 35-47. When she opened her eyes, she saw Gu Jinglian's head resting gently on her shoulder. His warm breath kept brushing against her cheeks. For a moment, she felt as if all the air that entered her lungs was coming from him. The breath that he exhaled seemed to be slightly hot. She only felt that her face was suddenly burning red. Instinctively, she pushed him, but his body did not move. He hugged her so tightly that she had the illusion that she was his most precious treasure. Chu-ho's expression became more and more unnatural. She saw that Gu Jinglian's breathing was heavy. It was probably because he had been too tired in the past few days that he fell into a deep sleep. She did not know when he had fallen asleep, so she could not bear to wake him up. Chu-ho closed her eyes and planned to rest for a while more. Suddenly, there was a shocking explosion at the entrance of the cave. The ear-piercing sound was deafening. Her ears were suddenly ringing from the explosion. Gu Jinglian also woke up instantly. He raised his head and heard a soft rustling sound coming from the entrance of the cave. Someone's coming. Chu Ho also reacted. She immediately stood up, picked up the submachine gun from the ground, and crouched in the corner. Gu Jinglian covered the entrance of the cave and held his breath vigilantly. However, the soft rustling sound outside the cave suddenly went far away. They did not seem to have noticed the entrance of the cave that was covered by the bushes. Immediately after, they heard the rumbling sound of tanks passing by outside the cave. Chu Ho carefully walked to the entrance of the cave. She pushed the bushes aside and looked outside. However, she saw several helicopters hovering in the sky above the coconut grove. The fog was thick, and visibility was extremely low. The huge leaf fans were making a desperate sound. "We should go," Gu Jinglian said. "Let's go now." Chu Ho nodded. Gu Jinglian asked nervously, "Can you walk on your own?" "Yes. I'm fine." After sleeping for a few hours, the pain of the wound had subsided a lot. She walked over and carried the combat bag. Gu Jinglian walked over, woke Lin Shi up, and gave him a gun. If they left this place, they might be ambushed by the rebel army at any time. It was impossible for him to carry him, so he could only do his best to cover him. However, even if he was a child, he still needed to carry a weapon with him under such circumstances. But Lin Shi said, "It's okay, I know how to use a gun." Growing up in such an environment, he knew how to use guns and basic self-defense. Gu Jinglian gave him a few more magazines. Lin Shi kept the magazines close to his body, and the three of them left the cave. Just as they walked out of the cave, the loud sounds suddenly became clearer. Bullets rained down in front of him. Gu Jinglian covered Lin Shi while Chu Ho followed behind him. One of them charged forward while the other had his back to Gu Jinglian to observe the situation behind them and provide cover. The three of them ran wildly in the rain of bullets. The clamor was accompanied by the sound of AK shots, and the tragic sound of gunfire reverberated in their eardrums. Gu Jinglian gave the only helmet to Lin Shi. 3 heavy bullets hung on his shoulders, 3 guns on his back, and a heavy Gatling gun in his hands. He ran at the front to open up a path. His pace was calm and fast. He turned back to estimate the distance and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Fire!" Chapter 35-48. The two of them cooperated well. At this moment, someone seemed to have discovered their deliberate trail, so they threw an infrared time grenade at them. Chu Ho saw it at a glance. This grenade took about 10 seconds to detonate. Chu Ho immediately walked over and kicked the grenade away. Gu Jinglian raised his AK-47 and fired a bullet, directly detonating the grenade. Chu Ho turned around and pushed Lin Shi to the ground. A scorching wave rushed over and brushed past their backs. Behind them, a huge cluster of flames rose, accompanied by heart-wrenching screams. It formed a towering wall of fire about 100 meters long in the coconut forest. Chu Ho struggled to support her body. She turned her head and glanced back. She saw several tanks passing through the ferocious fire and slowly approaching. The wave of air swept over violently. The tanks crossed the line of fire, and more than a dozen soldiers rushed down. Gu Jinglian had a long string of bullets on his shoulder, and his face was covered in sweat. He carried the extremely heavy Gatling gun and fired fiercely at the team behind him. Chu Ho held the XM-109 sniper rifle, and blood-white hot liquid sprayed endlessly at the edge of the forest. She didn't know how many people she had shot, but she vaguely felt that she had returned to her former mercenary career. As long as there was a bullet left, she would continue to slaughter lives. Several laser beams quickly scanned the forest. These were special instruments to detect life and electronic equipment. Gu Jinglian recognized them immediately. He gritted his teeth, nimbly turned over, and pulled off all the radio communication equipment on himself and Chu Ho, and threw them into the distance. The laser beam's positioning was messy. With a boom, a guided missile hit the position where the radio was thrown. Gu Jinglian grabbed Chu Ho's hand. Chu Ho directly hugged Lin Shi in her arms and rushed into the forest, temporarily obtaining cover. Chu Ho felt for the straw in her collar and hurriedly drank 2 mouthfuls of water. There wasn't much water stored in her jacket. She didn't even have time to add purification powder. The smell of water made her retch. But in this situation, there was no time to care so much. We're still 10 miles away from the signal tower. Gu Jinglian paused for a moment. The signal base station was built by Werther, so it's very safe. The communication equipment inside is more complete. After we go in, we'll send out a signal and shield the surroundings. We'll be temporarily protected. Expressionlessly, Chu-hee shook out the contents of her backpack and handed the energy bars and night vision goggles to Gu Jinglian. She then threw the AK and RPG-7B quiver on her back in front of him and began to swiftly load the Gatling gun with ammunition. Gu Jinglian broke off a piece of energy bar and stuffed it into his mouth. He mixed it with his saliva and quickly strapped his AK and rocket launcher to his shoulder. The atmosphere instantly became heavy. He looked at Chu Ho in front of him, and his hands froze. His eyebrows gradually became heavy. The odds are against us. Gu Jinglian said, "You also know that this place is surrounded by the rebel army. At this critical moment, I'll cover you. You leave first." Chu Ho raised her face, twitched the corner of her lips, threw the water bottle to Silver Fox, and quickly got up. "Listen, Gu Jinglian, we're together. If we want to leave, we'll leave together." Gu Jinglian didn't say anything. He knew, and Chu Ho probably also understood, that the current situation wasn't optimistic. Gu Jinglian wanted to protect her, even at the cost of his life. Chapter 35-49. Seeing that he was silent, Chu Ho's face darkened. She grabbed his chin and squeezed it tightly. "Listen up. Either we leave North Africa together, or we die together. There are no other options." Gu Jinglian looked up. His eyes flickered and his lips suddenly curved. "You won't regret it?" This woman was actually willing to risk her life with him. In such a dangerous environment, she said that she would either leave with him or die together. Was she really not afraid? Of course. "From the moment I decided to step on the cargo ship to North Africa, I won't regret it." Gu Jinglian also stood up and stared at her for a long time. Seeing that he kept staring at her, Chu Ho couldn't help but take half a step back. She said guiltily, "What are you doing?" "So, you admit it." Gu Jinglian said this without rhyme or reason. Chu Ho frowned. She didn't understand what he was trying to say. "What do you mean?" "You admit that you came to North Africa because you were worried about me." When Chu Ho heard this, her face immediately flushed red. She clenched her fists. Before she could refute, Gu Jinglian suddenly took a step forward and hugged her tightly with his right hand. He clasped the back of her neck and kissed her deeply. Lin Shi inadvertently saw this intimate scene. Her face immediately turned red and she immediately covered her face with both hands. It was not suitable for children. See no evil, hear no evil. Chu Ho wanted to push him away, but Gu Jinglian held her tightly. The more she struggled, the deeper she sank into his arms. Gu Jinglian kissed her until she was about to suffocate. He then released her, but he still wanted more and pecked her blushing face. Chu Ho's face became even hotter. She wanted to rebuke him, but she couldn't say a word for a long time. "Okay, don't waste time." Gu Jinglian turned the bag over and all the equipment fell to the ground at once. When Chu Ho heard this, anger rose in her heart. What did he mean by "don't waste time"? He was clearly the one who kissed her. And he still had the cheek to tell her not to waste time? She was about to explode when Gu Jinglian handed her a gun. A charming smile appeared on his handsome face that was stained with dust. "Let's kill our way out." Chu Ho immediately laughed. She took the gun from him and tied it to her waist. At this moment, the winds of war in the west and artillery fire spread. Thick smoke billowed from the coconut grove, and flames flickered. The HU-5 grenade exploded with a huge shockwave. The earth shook, and the aura of death once again gathered around the land. The tank rumbled past the ruins, the wreckage, and the shadows of the trees. The helicopter hovered in the air, and several white signal lights swept through the forest. He carefully hunched her back and snuck into the forest alone. The thorns mercilessly slashed across her cheeks, causing blood to gush out of the wounds. She hugged a Barrett M99 sniper rifle. Her footsteps were steady, her expression was cold, and her face was covered in dust. She leaned against a hidden tree and squatted down. She took out a straw from her collar and drank the last mouthful of water stored in her jacket. Her lips were still pale and dry. Although she was wearing a bulletproof vest over her camouflage uniform, her beautiful figure was still exposed. Chapter 35-50. Gu Jinglian and Lin Shi followed closely behind her. They leaned against the barrier and raised their hands to wipe away the blood and dirt on their faces. Chu Ho looked at him. Gu Jinglian's hair was messed up in the wind, and his handsome face was ravaged by the wind. Beneath his handsome eyebrows was a pair of seductive peach blossom eyes. Time ticked by. Chu Ho rested for a while before turning around and crouching behind a tree. She raised the heavy sniper rifle in her hand and aimed accurately at the lens. She slowly narrowed one eye and focused all her attention on the sniper scope. She held her breath and waited calmly. She counted silently in her heart. Suddenly, Chu Ho pulled the trigger. The rapid ammunition detonated the improvised explosive device that had been deployed earlier. With a loud bang, a tank was blocked 100 meters away from the wall of fire. Chu Ho slung the sniper rifle over her shoulder and injected the last dose of adrenaline. She pulled out a military-grade dagger and ran toward the tank. Gu Jinglian quickly followed. An M1A1 tank was parked quietly in place. At that moment, a nimble figure silently snuck behind the tank and opened the door to the combat room. The soldier in the combat room didn't even have time to see who it was before he was punched in the head. Before he could react, a strong arm picked up his tottering body and twirled the dagger in the soldier's hand. The poor man felt a chill in his throat and hot blood sprayed onto the passenger seat. The stench of blood assailed his nostrils. Chu Ho quickly used the same method to sneak into the engine room, leaving behind a collapsed corpse and a messy cabin. She crept toward the cockpit. Zaifi. Zaifi. There's an affair. Zaifi, please answer if you hear me. Please answer if you hear me. Zaifi, quickly lock onto the target. A man's standard English voice rang out from the cockpit of the tank. However, there was an eerie silence in the cabin. No one answered. A sturdy combat boot stepped on a corpse that was gradually turning cold. Chu Ho lifted his cold face. Blood was flowing from the dagger in front of him. She wiped away the blood that had splattered on her face, and her eyes revealed a ferocious look. She kicked away the corpse that was in the way and cut off the radio communication. The noise stopped abruptly, and the cabin returned to silence. She was very familiar with the operation of the tank. In just a few seconds, Chu Ho quickly adapted to the operation of the M1A1. Gu Jinglian also got into the tank. One person was in charge of setting up the tank, while the other was in charge of the turret. She skillfully pushed the joystick and cut into the order, her cold eyes surging like a storm. Zaifi. Please answer if you hear me. Please answer if you hear me. In the cockpit of another tank, a man with chestnut hair shouted at the top of his lungs. He cursed as he gasped for breath, the veins on his forehead bulging. The burly man was sweating profusely as an inexplicable uneasiness rose in his heart. In that breathtaking moment, a beam of fire whistled through the air. The man with chestnut hair only felt the cabin shake violently. He was so shocked that he fell back into his seat. This shot had fatally struck the main turret of the tank, and the core of the attack had been accurately destroyed. Chapter 35-51. Chu Ho held the joystick with both hands, and her gaze was domineering. Gu Jinglian controlled the turret and kept attacking the target. Under the attack of the artillery, the target tank crashed into a tree trunk and flipped over. You drove the tank well. Gu Jinglian rarely praised. Chu Ho also said, your aim is not bad. The two of them looked at each other and smiled. At such a dangerous moment, the two of them could still talk and laugh so easily. Chu-ho said, I've driven tanks, nuclear submarines, and armored vehicles before. Gu Jinglian said, this is the first time in my life that I've driven a tank. But I saw that you were so familiar with it that I thought you had experience. I'm just learning now. The two of them reached a safe area and found Lin Shi. Chu-ho drove the tank until they were outside the battlefield. There was an armored vehicle parked by the side of the road. When the lights came on, there was someone inside. Chu-ho used the same trick again and sneaked into the armored vehicle. After killing the soldiers who had let down their guard, Gu Jinglian got into the car with Lin Shi. She drove the armored vehicle, and the three of them sped towards the signal base station. The night was dark, and dark clouds covered the moon. The hazy light and shadow shone into the abandoned signal tower, making it look like a lonely city. The three of them rushed to the signal base station, but Gu Jinglian did not see anyone else. He walked into the signal base station, but there was no one inside. Gu Jinglian's eyes darkened, but he had already guessed that the team that was separated from him was probably dead. After all, having too many people would be a burden. That team was not made up of elite soldiers. There were many engineers and higher-ups in it. They did not have the strength to truss a chicken and could not even shoot accurately. It was indeed difficult to break out of the encirclement with so many people. If it were not for Chu-ho, he would not have been able to kill his way out on his own. After all, war was merciless. No one had an absolute halo, and deaths and injuries were inevitable. Chu-ho also expected that those people had probably died in the battlefield, but she heard Gu Jinglian say, we don't have engineers. The signal may not be able to be repaired. It's all right. Chu-ho smiled and walked to the dashboard. He opened the hidden door and looked at the circuit inside. Find the toolbox. I'll give it a try. You can? Yes. Chu-ho's reply was concise and comprehensive. Gu Jinglian and Lin Shi immediately split up to look for the toolbox. They finally found it in the cupboard. In the sky far away, the smoke of gunpowder gradually spread out, and the clamor of firearms gradually came to an end. 8,000 meters away from the coconut grove, a well-equipped, fully armed team was rapidly closing in on the signal tower. Max, lead the 7th Division and surround the signal tower in the north. Storm, you and the 9th Division will break through the encirclement with me. A man in a camouflage uniform was crawling in front of the broken wall. He was the leader of the entire team. The man turned around and ordered his men with a serious expression. He said solemnly, we just received news that a suspected government spy has sneaked into the war zone and is heading towards the signal tower. We have to surround them and eliminate the spy. A group of Special Forces soldiers holding Browning M2 machine guns nodded quietly. Soon, the lighthouse let out an alarm that resounded through the sky. Beams of signal beams crisscrossed and rotated in the sky. The man calmly waved his hand and said in a low voice, charge. Chapter 3552. The leader held his head high and led the elite division to the north of the lighthouse. At this moment, a sniper rifle shot rang out, and Max fell to the ground with a thud. His head had been accurately blown off. The bullet was too powerful and seemed to have been carefully modified. Poor D, whose head was a bloody mess. It was too horrible to look at. The leader was stunned. However, in the next moment, a fireball whizzed towards the 7th Division like a meteor with a thick tail of smoke behind it. The leader of the division roared in grief and indignation. Following a loud explosion, miserable howls of pain could be heard. The Apira's rocket launcher had overturned the entire 7th Division, and an earth-shattering shockwave swept over them. Then, a cold voice echoed through the loudspeaker in the silent night. I'm warning you. No matter whose unit you're from, retreat 5 miles away immediately. Otherwise, I won't show any mercy. The cold and arrogant voice reverberated in the ruins. The man looked around cautiously, but he could not see anyone. The voice said again, hey, I'm up there. The man looked up and saw Chu-ho with her black hair dancing in the wind. She stood proudly at the top of the lighthouse with her arms crossed. Behind her, signal beams crisscrossed and overlapped. The strong wind lifted the coat tied around her waist. She looked valiant. Chu Ho's expression was arrogant. Her slim figure was like a phantom from the Azura Palace, cold and heartless. She gently stroked the modified Barrett M99 sniper rifle in her arms. From time to time, she tilted her head and opened the scope to aim at the leader's head. She smiled eerily and said, "If you want to go to hell, I don't mind you taking one step closer." The man's expression changed. Panic flashed through his eyes. The group of special forces also panicked. They stood still and did not dare to act rashly. The leader raised the loudspeaker and said sternly, "Are you spies sent by the government? If you hand over the information in your hands now, we'll let you live immediately." Chu Ho raised her eyebrows and said sarcastically, "Oh? Looks like there's a misunderstanding. I'm not a spy. Those casualties in the battle zone, were they your doing?" "Yes." Chu Ho admitted, "It was you rebels who wanted to kill me for no reason. I was just trying to protect myself." The leader's face turned cold and a chill ran down his spine. An army of more than 100 people had been completely annihilated by this seemingly weak woman. Who was she? "So many of our brothers have been killed by you. This blood debt must be paid." Chu Ho sneered and